Hello, and welcome to another 1-7 Design Hangout chat. I'm joined once again by Jonathan Walton and Stras Acimovic. Did I get that right, Stras?
It's
Is that
Akimovic, but it's all right. It's all good.
Acimovic? Sorry. Uh, and let's dive right into it. We have an actual topic this time to start with. So, Jonathan, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Uh, so Grey Pond was talking a little bit on the internet about um, drafts and the kind of versioning that happens when you're going from sort of an early notes from the idea to an alpha draft to something that's ready for external playtesting to uh, the magical jump that happens somewhere between there and a finished game. And I wanted to talk specifically about the magical jump a little bit because I feel like there's a lot of talk that we do about the early part, right? How do you have ideas and get ideas into a playtestable draft and then like play it with some people, and how do you solve problems with that kind of stuff, and how do you make revisions to your draft and that kind of thing. But I think one thing that's sometimes a little bit more mysterious is going from the solid beta draft, right, where you've seen some play, you've seen some external play. How do you go from that to something that you feel like releasing as a finished game, and maybe even something that you sell for money, right? Which I think is sometimes something that's really hard for people to think about. You know, there's the risk that somebody's going to buy it and they're going to be like, this game is terrible, I wasted my money, or whatever. At least in people's heads, right? And how do you either stop worrying about that, or how do you get the game to the point where you don't have to worry about that? So anyway, I was thinking a little bit about that, and I was also thinking about how many of my games have become kind of stuck in the beta stage. I know this is the case for some of John's games as well. I don't know if Strash, if what kind of your experience is, but my experience has been that it's easy for me to get an alpha draft. Nowadays, it's pretty easy for me to find a group or find a couple of external groups and have it be played a little bit and get some feedback and make some revisions. But then finding the time and the energy and just the things that I need to do to get the game from this sort of relatively solid beta draft to a finished game that I'm either done with or done with for now or whatever. That part is really hard for me. So I wanted to kind of throw that out there a little bit and talk a little bit about it. I have some ideas about it, but I wanted to kind of open it to you guys first. And if you've had similar experiences, or sort of how do you think about going from a playable draft to the finished part of the game? And I mean, Strauss, you're doing this right now, right? So maybe you have some insights on how that's working for you.
Hang on, had my mic muted. All right. So, wow, this is such a weighty topic. A lot of games kind of get stuck in this stage, and there's a long-standing axiom in programming that the last 20% of the work takes 80%, or the last 20% of the product takes 80% of the work. And so I think there's a couple of problems because when you first start, there's that rush. You're coming up with new mechanics. You're doing a play storm. Every single iteration, you're seeing, progress. And then you get to this point where you have to stop thinking about yourself, because usually by the time you've pushed it out to beta, it's probably good enough for you and your friends to play, right? And so now you're starting to think about how people other than you perceive it. So one of the things that I say a lot to my playtesters is, please help me. You have to understand that I am reading the text that I think I'm writing, not the text that I'm actually writing. And so a lot of times communicating things is very difficult because you're no longer just slapping stuff down on a page. You have to think about kind of like how people absorb it, what is the flow of learning, and things like that. And so it's a completely different skill set. So like if you're a single designer, obviously you have to wear many hats. But a lot of the stuff that people like doing, like where they come up with a innovative mechanic, or they come up with like a really clever way of doing something, or something that just feels really pleasing, this is a very different ballgame. It's almost like this long-range psychology of some sort. So one of the things that I'm finding is helping me a lot is making myself a roadmap, because the concept that I have to rework everything, or the fact that I don't even know what I need to rework because it's not just for me. It's not something that I can just sit down and look at and be like, oh yeah, I can fix this. One of the things that I find is helping me is having a very concrete set of steps. So like, for example, I have like, I will finish this by today, and then when I do this, 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 and this, then I will release a new version, and that's going to be a thing. And when I know that I can get this done in 1 hour, 3 hours, or 6 hours, or whatever, it's a lot easier to kind of put my butt in the seat and get the work done, because it's no longer this like monstrous unknown. It's just work, right? And so that's something I can do.
Can I jump in and emphasize something you said real quick?
Yeah.
There's the thing that you said that was really interesting to me was that it's at the point where it's good enough for you and your players locally, right? That it's like you could play it till the end of time and be happy with it, right? You don't need any more stuff. You've done all the materials that you would need to play it, which is kind of an interesting thing. And for me, that's often where like the energy for me just goes way down, right? Because I'm like, I can play this. This game's done. What are you talking about? It's totally fine. So yeah, I wanted to emphasize that because I think that was a really cool part of what you said, and I do like what you're saying too about sort of making a list of concrete things that you need to get done as a way of sort of pushing you through the process. That's cool. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's what we're here for, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the other thing that's sort of paralyzed me before is something you guys don't have so much trouble with is for me, layout and graphics is a nightmare. So I have a game that I was working on, and I sent it out to some people, and they were like, "Where's the character sheet?" And I was like, I don't know how to make one. And so like they're like, "Well, I'm not even gonna look at this if it doesn't have a character sheet." So I don't know, like you have to wear different hats, and so I think one of the reasons why AR is doing quite as well as it is instead of making this thing that looks like horrible and primitive and ugly, you look at it and you're like, I've put so much work in this. This looks terrible. I have a partner who's actually like taking it upon his shoulders to actually get a lot of that stuff done. So when I make a change, then I see this like gorgeous character sheet come out that has like all the stuff on it, and I feel like there's progress being made. It's a real thing. It's concrete. I can hold it in my hands. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we talked about this last time, that can be a real double-edged sword on how polished it is can sometimes make you want to keep stuff that you maybe shouldn't. But I also want to go back to that point Jonathan emphasized about that. I think you had identified a really key transition point there, Stras, about what's sufficient for you versus what's sufficient for someone else. And I think you're totally right. It's a completely different skill set, and it's in some ways it's what people think of when they think of game design, I think. Or I think generally when I talk to people, they think it's one thing or the other. They think it's coming up with a cool idea, then that's what game design is, or it's the communication part. But I think you've correctly identified perfectly that it's you do one and then you have to do the second one. If you can't communicate it beyond your group, you're still doing game design. And a lot of GMs, I think, do that level of game design all the time. But that communication phase, and not only is it switching gears into some new thing, but it's the spectrum of possibilities opens up so much. At that point, your game can be a series of videos, it could be a pamphlet, it can be a book, it can be a bunch of cards, like how you navigate that transition from, I have an idea for a thing to do at a table, now I need to communicate it using some materials. What are those materials even going to be is sometimes a place where the brakes get put on, and I know I've done that where I've gotten fairly far down a process of that transition and thought, oh, what am I doing? This should totally be cards, or oh no, cards was dumb. Why did I even bother with, and I just get stuck in this like product design phase a little bit. But I also wanted to say that I've released 2 games essentially at the end of that first phase. World of Dungeons and Lady Blackbird both are pretty much, with some light editing, not none, but just a little, are basically what that's what I made to play with my local group, and then released it. and it's not impossible for that to be functional, but I think the criticisms of both of those games are very spot on, at which I think Judd has said this, particularly about Lady Blackbird, that because I didn't do that second phase, the people that have great success with Lady Blackbird are essentially the same as my local group. And the closer you are to that group, obviously the more suitable those materials are to you. But I do think there is a place there for, especially for free products, where that's a viable place when you hit that wall and you run out of that initial energy, but you have materials to actually play the game with. I think it is okay to take the leap there and share it and not feel like you always have to slog through this beta phase we're going to talk about next, but that it is okay to take that initial playable set of stuff and share it and let other people dive in, and like with the Wildlings, that's what I did. I got it to that point and then released it, and now Michael White basically is running with the game and finishing it and doing the whole beta work that I didn't want to do. So that I think that transition point is super important, but there's a lot of ways to deal with it when it comes up.
When we're on big picture things, the point about Lady Blackbird is really interesting, that because you haven't filled in a lot of the details, you said that the audience is basically the same as your home group, and what that means is kind of like there has to be significant overlap in terms of your sort of background in games, right? You've either played similar games, or you've are comfortable taking this thing and just kind of going with it, right? Because you approached other games that way before, where you're asking your audience to bring the other half of it, and either they bring the other half that's similar to the half that you bring to it when you play it, or it could be different, but as long as it's functional enough, which could be luck, or it could be skill, or it could be all sorts of things, right? It's still going to work for them, right? And I think, and both you and I have had these sort of beta games like Geiger Counter and Lady Blackbird and stuff that have been played hundreds of times, but are not yet sort of past this sort of median stage, at least in our own minds, right? So that's kind of interesting. It's not like they don't have an audience; they just have an audience of hundreds, maybe low thousands of people who have played stuff similarly, or can take the stuff and run with it, right?
Consumption of media. One of the things that I noticed actually in playtesting a couple of John's games was that a lot of times he would throw something out as a reference, and I would catch it, and the people that didn't understand where he was coming from in a specific arc from that would oftentimes not see the steps that they needed to do to complete the half that was missing. So.
Yes, I think that's a great point. Most of these minimal projects or half-finished things or alphas or whatever, and even full-fledged games do this too, but the more you can lean, obviously, on reference and a certain play culture and a certain media culture and all those things, it's like any kind of contemporary media. I think the more immersed you are in it, the more you get out of it, and the more you're gonna. There are all forms of media now that are just nothing but references to other things, and I think that is a real powerful aspect of role-playing design, and also in video games too, to rapidly get someone up to speed that's already familiar with a platformer or a shooter or whatever. It gives you a lot of, if that's your audience, when you're making the next hardcore shooter, you can just kind of ignore the people that are learning how to play for the first time, if that's your goal. But if we are talking about, and I think we are going to get to this, designing a game for a much wider audience, or at least a bigger audience than the alpha, then you do have to take on that bigger job. And I don't know, maybe we can start talking about it, like identifying that when that phase happens, and then also I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is the audience. Like, in order to start that beta phase, I really need to think very hard, or have a strong gut feeling about who I'm designing the game for. Because otherwise, I think my goals are going to be really murky and hard to hard to deal with. Like I don't think I go through a phase where I sit down and I go, okay, audience, let's figure this out. I think it's much more intuitive than that, but that's the first razor I think I bring in at that phase to say, okay, what's in and what's out, what's my vector for starting to build these instructions. I need to know who I'm writing the instructions for, I guess.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add on before we jump right into sort of how you might approach this second phase is that the second half that we're talking about here, even though like Stras says, it's like 80-90% of the work, it doesn't necessarily have to be super long, which is something that I think people get confused about, right? Like sometimes people just need an orientation to what is this thing that we're doing. How is it similar or different to the things I've done before? What are you going to be asking me to do? When I have problems, what kinds of things should I be thinking about? Right? I mean, it could be like a single page or 2 pages. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, Apocalypse World 100 pages of explaining you detail by detail what to do. That's great if you want to do that. I'm very thankful for authors who do go through and dig into the nitty-gritty and tell you about that kind of stuff, because then I can draw on it and don't have to do it. But like you said, if your audience, if you can identify your audience, then all you need is to bridge the gap between where they are and the things that you're asking them to do, which may or may not be a huge gap, but it is still really difficult because you're trying to articulate things that you already know, maybe intuitively, that you don't spend a lot of time thinking about sometimes, right? And you're trying to think from the point of view of somebody who's not yourself, which we try to do all the time in RPGs, but is really hard, especially if you don't have a really good sense of them or what they need, which sometimes is the case, I think. But yeah, I don't think it has to be long. It just has to be good, kind of, which is also difficult, right? So.
Yeah, I think that's true. The scope of the project is almost a separate issue, although it does contribute to being stuck in the beta phase. I think the bigger that project is, especially if you're a solo designer, the workload for that, if it's a very big kind of game, like Kevin Crawford, I don't know how he does it at the rate he does it. He produces these big, awesome books that just, and how many has he done? Like 12 or something? Like he's so prolific. It's incredible. I don't know what his playtest process is like, or his design process. It'd be interesting to get him on here and talk about it. But I was trying to say that scope, it does play a factor, but I think you're right, Jonathan, that it doesn't have to be this long process. Difficulty and scope, I guess, are two separate vectors.
Yeah, and
two separate axes.
To plug into your audience point too, like there's a lot of people who assume you have to start with what is role playing, right? But if your audience is role players, then you don't have to write that part at all, right? Which is,
there's a really good example of this that just came out. Chris McDowell's game Into the Odd. I'll put a link in the comments. It is just for minimalism in gaming, man, it is something else. It jumps you right in. It doesn't tell you what a role-playing game is. It doesn't tell you what a game master is. It doesn't tell you what a player is. It doesn't tell you what characters are even. It just starts with like how to roll up your stats and how to do stuff, but it has all these little nuggets in it that do teach you how to play a role-playing game and how to run a role-playing game and how to be a player in this game. And it has these little instructions that actually do tell you what you're supposed to be doing, but it's so immersed in the role-playing culture. Like Chris knows who's going to buy his product. He knows it's for this particular audience mostly, and I would say probably like 80% of that audience has already played it because it's been out publicly forever, and like he just it's very shrewd. That the structure of that book is so well done, and the layout too. I forget who did it. Maybe Jeff Russell. I can't remember right now, but he kept the format of the PDF for the most part, where each page, they're little 6x9 pages, and it's one concept per page. everything about your character is one page. Everything about how to use magic is one little sheet. So it just breaks it down to these nice little digestible chunks. And he never backs all the way out and tries to write his whole treatise on what gaming is or what role-playing is. Just focuses it very sharply on this particular tiny, very focused thing. Like, it's not even like, what's a dungeon crawl? He doesn't even go there. It's really impressive. Very inspiring, I think, for people who are trying to do this themselves, to see an example that is not Stars Without Number. That's something that's really, achievable, even though it requires a lot of skill. It's not like this massive scope to do.
Totally. I'm excited. I haven't actually read it yet, but obviously what I know of Into the Odd is pretty awesome.
It is wonderful. I can't wait to start a campaign. Probably when Atlas Reckoning is done, actually, we'll switch over to Into the Odd. I think that's next on the list.
Jeff Russell did the layout since you asked.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. I got it right. Yes. And I think it was Jeff's first layout job. It's really great. He did a wonderful job. Really, really cool. Yes, sorry. So back to the topic at hand.
No, it's cool. It's totally awesome. So, can I pitch you something? So,
yeah.
The brief notes that I wrote down for like what we're going to talk about, since I wanted to not forget what I was trying to say. So when I was thinking about how you go from a sort of early beta to a finished game, I was thinking about sort of different. I started out thinking about different approaches people have to the playtesting process, which is related to but not the same as the writing process, obviously. And I was thinking about there might be sort of this like platonic ideal of these kind of two approaches to playtesting. One, I was calling my head the sort of brute force method, where you just do a lot of it with as many people as possible, with many different kinds of people over and over again, until you kind of iron out all the wrinkles in your game, and it works perfectly, and you've kind of followed this kind of scientific way of doing it, where it's just a repeated experimentation until it does what you want. And maybe the platonic ideal, the closest I can think of to the platonic ideal might be Ben Robbins, who just plays this game with so many different people who've never played the game before, people who've never seen the game before, over and over again until it's like a well-oiled machine, right? And then at the other end of the spectrum was I was calling the finesse method in my head, which is like you play it a little bit, but you're this like genius designer who is able to kind of make these sort of elegant, easy sort of changes to the rules. You see immediately what the problem is, and you just fix it. And you don't need to play it that much because it's pretty much perfect already when it came out of your head. You just kind of need to like try it out a little bit, right? And I think most of us fall somewhere in between these kind of platonic ideals, right? You do some playtesting, you use some of your genius, because you can playtest a game over and over again, and sometimes it doesn't show you the kinds of problems that you want to see, or it doesn't. The playtest itself doesn't help you figure out how to fix the problems, right? It just shows you what the problems are. So anyway, this is when I was thinking about playtesting as sort of part of this process of moving from beta to finished game. These two poles kind of stood out in my head, and I sort of wonder what you guys think about that idea, and maybe where you fall on the spectrum of that, maybe.
So I actually I playtest a lot for a lot of people. It's like my thing. So I guess I'll tackle this a little bit. I think one of the important things about playtesting is less to try the shotgun rock salt method, which is just, keep playtesting, and then, eventually you'll have enough data, and that'll tell you everything you need to know. And I think that a lot of people, one of the big problems is that we don't, like, as a community, we don't have necessarily a very good playtest routine. Like, actually, I want to talk about this. Design in general is a black box, right? Like, everybody assumes that designers are, I don't know, some form of genius or something, because, you kind of go into a room, and then nobody talks about the actual process of their design. Like, everybody says, like, oh, I'll put something out in 15 days, or, look for this next year, or I had this great thing, and I'm playing with my group, and it's super fun. And then there's this, like, period of silence, or, like, secret things happening in the background, and then, boom, a product appears. And so people assume that that's the thing. Like, very few people actually talk about, like, all right, so let's talk about how you playtest, or let's talk about how I solve design issues. Like, that's just, there's not a lot of information out there. Like, a lot of people will talk about, like, marketing and how to make your book look pretty and how, a product's important, but very few people actually talk about, like, how do you design around a problem, or who do you talk to, like, what do you do? So, and I think that's partially because a lot of designers maybe want to appear like they're super smart, or maybe because they're ashamed of showing exactly how much struggle and pain there is in this. So in any case, playtesting. We don't have formal playtest techniques. Go, John.
I have a quick interjection on that one, which is in our case, like Jonathan and I, it's invisible because we were doing that kind of stuff face to face, and I think that's fairly common that most designers have a pretty close circle of people that they talk to about this stuff and work through it, and it's less on the internet than it used to be. It happened on the Forge a bit, happened on Story Games a little bit. I guess it happened on the Forge a lot at first, but yeah, there's a lot of face-to-face of that, and it's not getting captured and archived and shared as much as it could to really be helpful. And I'm hoping more of that can happen with these kind of videos, but yeah, that's definitely, I think that was my case, was we found somebody to, like, do that process with face-to-face, and no one else can see it.
Yeah, and to build on that, I mean, I do agree that part of the impetus for doing these kind of conversations live on the internet was to show people the kinds of conversations that John and I were having on a regular basis. But the other thing is, like for me, I'm always very open about my design process. I mean, if it used to be all on my blog, now it's basically all on G+, so it's harder because it's not as public because it's within the circles or whatever that I post to. But I have an indie game circle that's like 350 people, and I post constantly about random game design thoughts that I'm having. They kind of, like, eventually get compiled. Sometimes I get feedback from people, and that kind of works its way into threads. And then often when I go to an InDesign document, what I'm opening is nowadays is a bunch of G+ threads where I've tagged some stuff about the same theme, or I've searched for it and kind of opened them in separate windows, and then I'm taking stuff out of those threads that I posted, some of which is terrible, and putting it into an InDesign document or a Word document, and then kind of cleaning it up and changing the text and stuff. So I've actually always done a lot of my design in public, whether it was in the Forge or in G+. And not everybody does that. There's not necessarily a good reason to do it, I guess, except that I feel like it's important to model to other people kind of how the process happens, I guess. And it's easy to get derailed too. I think this is one thing that also happened in the indie game design threads on the Forge even, is that somebody would be like, I have this idea, here's a rough idea, here's a general dice mechanic, here's the theme. And then people would come in and be like, oh, what about this? And what about that? And what about this other thing? And soon the original poster is designing this game that's nothing at all like what their original intentions were. So there's definitely things about bringing your ideas before an audience too early when they're not solid enough in your own mind that you can say, no, it's not about that. Because if you're still, it's still kind of this open, fluid thing, other people's input can really derail you. And so I think in some ways that's why more people and more experienced designers sometimes pull back from doing a lot of public design. And also, if you're really big, right, if you have a following of hundreds or thousands of people and you post some ideas about a thing, people really latch onto them. And then sometimes if you release a draft that's different from what you originally said you were going to do, people have a hard time letting go, right? That they're like, well, you said you were going to do this game about mecha and it was going to have like D20 giant laser cannons, and I've totally already written a supplement for it. But now you're using D8s for your giant cannons. Like, what even happened, man? Like, the whole point of it was that you had this giant cannonball-shaped D20 that was going to roll across the table and hit this other ship, and it had this really visceral thing, right? It was like critical to my experience of this game, and now you're using D8s, man. Like, what's even going on? So there's definitely reasons why people pull back from designing in public, but I do think. So it's a complicated thing, I think. So,
I don't think there's a problem with not designing in public, but I would certainly like to see more articles for posterity after the process is done, maybe documenting how people go about stuff. Um, there are microscopic tidbits that you see now and again. An example last month is Jason Morningstar actually posted, it was as a joke, a snippet from their Night Witches GDocs document. And I actually sat down and took apart how they collaborate on a GDoc productively from that. And that taught me more about their design methodology than half of the essays that people write about, like, what's a useful mechanic. So I don't know if that comes across.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome. That's wonderful, and you're totally right. Like, documenting after the fact is such a hard thing to do. People are terrible at it. In the creative industry, like, you would think that a creative agency would document all their work to put it in their portfolio and get new business, but we never, ever, ever did. Like, it was a miracle if someone took a photo during any part of the design process, or if anyone kept their sketches, or if even someone shot video at the event that we produced. Like, it's just, people are horrible at that. And you're so right. Like, practical, especially if you're already a technician of some type, seeing someone else, seeing their actual sort of shrapnel or bits and pieces is so instructive, way more than an essay about that thing. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. It's something with martial arts, like YouTube has revolutionized that completely, because you used to either have personal instruction, or you had to learn from something from a book, which is just impossible to do with that kind of thing. It's really, unless you're already like 99% of the way there. But if you're like 60% of the way there and you watch 6 videos of dudes rolling on the mats going for their armbar, you're like, okay, I see what I'm doing wrong now. His hips are up and mine should, or whatever. And I think it's the same kind of thing where once you get to a certain point and you kind of get it to some degree, just seeing someone's little note you can have this mind-blowing experience where, like, wait, that's how you do that? Oh man, like, I should do that too. And yeah, we need way more of that. And I agree with Jonathan completely that doing it ahead of time is fraught with peril. But yeah, sharing stuff. Jason also shared all the iterations of the character sheet from Night Witches, which I'm definitely going to do with my next project. That is an amazing idea. And once he posted it, I went back through and I made PDFs of all my old sheets for this game, and it is hilarious. There's stuff I had completely forgotten about, like, oh yeah, this game was based on Other Kind for like a week. I forgot about that. Yeah, and I think that could be really instructive for sure.
To add something about Jason Morningstar's character sheet thing, there's an article based on that presentation that's coming out in Analog Game Studies, which is an online journal, and the article comes out tomorrow. So by the time you see this, it's probably already going to be out, and you can read Jason Morningstar's article about the character sheets for Night Witches.
Oh, that's awesome. Cool. Man, that guy's everywhere. He's fucking playing with the mountain goats, and jeez, he's a superstar. Or the mountain goat, I guess I should say. Sorry, Stras. So we interrupted your flow there. Sorry, you were talking about playtesting.
Yeah, it sounded like you were more on the repetition end of the spectrum.
I'm actually not sorry at all, but I say that just to be polite.
It's all good. So I lost my train of thought. So yeah, we were talking about, oh yes, going through betas and beta protocols. So one of the things is that I actually work with a lot of designers, and the thing is that a lot of like art has critique, and critique has techniques, and you can have people who are good at it and bad at it, but there's a lot of stuff that's written about it, and there's certain formats and practices that people follow, and things like that. And so it actually is kind of shocking to me. We're a very analytical crowd. Like, gamers are super analytical, and this is not something that's really been over-analyzed, and it's a very difficult medium to communicate. One of the things, John actually talked about this, is the videos that were posted from the actual play for Blades really kind of change perspective. And one of the things that is difficult is, on one hand, you running playtests will be informative, but up to a point, because whenever somebody asks you, a lot of times you're smoothing over rules, right? Like if there's a rough edge or an exception, you know how it should be handled, but it's not necessarily in the text. And so a lot of times you need to hand off your text to somebody that isn't necessarily part of your group. Like they kind of get it, but they're not, directly involved with you, and so they haven't inherited all of your polish that you're inadvertently putting into like the actual play experience. And so I try to do the best that I can in terms of AP reports, but writing AP reports is a science, and it's also a huge time investment. And so one of the things that I don't see in playtest reports, and this is I think something that people should be doing more and more often, is guided questions, because a lot of people who do playtesting just sort of throw it out there, and then people run a game and they tell you whatever is on their mind, and sometimes that's useful because sometimes you didn't think of stuff to ask, but a lot of times there are specific things that you're looking for, and sometimes the 16-page approach is maybe not the most beneficial. So I don't know. Yeah, we don't have a lot of formal playtesting technique, and I don't know that a lot of people talk about how their playtests are going. Usually you get, everything's great, our game is awesome, people love it, please buy it. So
yeah, I think part of it is that like you said, gamers tend to be very analytical or something, but I mean, what playtesting really is it's almost like social science, right? You need to have these sort of like formal, structured things where you're asking people questions. But I mean, there's a lot of controversy in social science about how you do that, right? Do you ask people the same questions all the time? Is that going to give you the information that you need from them? Like you need to, like, how do you inform the way that you approach things, right? And so I think, but I think our solution often is to just like you say, is to sort of haphazardly do stuff, right? Like people write AP, and then somehow you're supposed to distill the things that you need from this like 5 or 6 paragraph, or maybe like you say 16-page email where people tell you how it went, right? So for sure, our playtesting could be more something, right? And I sort of hope that sort of hangout games or video recordings of games could be a really good way to start, right? Because the thing about video recording is like, if you don't really know exactly what you're looking for, if you want people to engage with this text and come up with their own stuff, which is what we ask people to do, right? They're going to come up with all sorts of things, right? And some of them are going to be great, even though they're not what you intended, and some of them are going to be not what you intended and terrible, right? And figuring out how to help people come up with things you didn't intend that are still good is like a really, really challenging part of the process, right? And so I think video might be a really good way to try to do that, right? Because you can see, it's not like being in the game, it's totally different, but you can see what's going on without having to be particularly looking for it or asking questions about it, right? So you see the stuff that you don't know to ask about, the unknown unknowns, right, as people famously said, right? So I don't know, but you're right. We could totally get better at having more structure or more formal procedures for how we're doing playtesting, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And Luke Crane has pretty detailed kind of like breakdown of how he does playtesting. I think it's on the Burning Wheel forums. I might have been on the Forge. I can't quite remember. I bet you could pull it up somewhere. It's very Luke. It's very like precise and extremely good stuff. And it focuses a lot, as I recall, on external playtesting as like the real meat and potatoes part of it. Jonathan, you asked about like brute force versus more intuitive playtesting, I guess, was the distinction. And Luke, as I recall, I may be misquoting him, but he did really talk very heavily about how you don't really know your game at all until external playtesting starts. And I don't totally agree with that. I think it's true as a bit of playtesting dogma to inspire people to do external playtesting. Like, you don't know your game until it's been playtested externally, son. could get behind that as a article of faith, but in truth, I don't think that's totally true. I know Luke's partner, Jared Sorensen, doesn't totally believe that. He's released awesome games that were never playtested even once. But in terms of the distinction, the brute force versus the sort of intuitive approach, I think it's great that you identified those as points on the spectrum, and like a lot of times you do that, it doesn't make sense to go to one end or the other. That you kind of have to do both of those. You need to have enough intuition, so you're not just putting something random in front of people to be tested. There has to be enough intuition or alpha testing with your home group or whatever to get it to a certain point where there's a certain degree of confidence in the thing, and that might all go away when people start playtesting it, but externally. But it's not nothing, and it's also not just pure. Well, this seems about right, and we'll just guess at the numbers and it'll be fine. So yeah, I think I don't know if I could argue for one extreme or the other in that model being a better approach. It seems like a blend of those things is probably what you want to strive for. But then when it comes to external playtesting, I just had an experience that I'm going to try to put in future playtest sort of questionnaires or guides or whatever. Rachel Walton was running Blades in the Dark, and I asked her they're doing it on Hangout, so I asked her if she would record them, and she agreed to record them for me. And they've been giving me great feedback and literally talking to the camera, like, "Hey John, this is what we think," which is really good. But then something kind of magical happened in one of the recordings where the game was petering out. They were finishing up the session, doing experience, and then somebody said something about, "Well, I'm not really sure how this works exactly." And someone else said, "Well, what does it say in the text?" They pulled up a piece of paper and they were kind of looking at it, and then the magical thing happened. Sarah paraphrased and summarized what she thought the text meant, and it was wonderful. As soon as she started doing that, I was like, "Oh my God, this is what I need. This is exactly what I need." She just read it quietly to herself and then told the group what it meant to her. And I was like, man, this is what you want from playtesting. This is in this beta phase, right? You want to see if your words on paper are a teaching tool for someone else, because this is what happens when you play a role-playing game. Odds are one person reads it and then tells everyone else how to do it. And that process needs to be really successful. And watching her do that, I was like, man, I've got to bottle this somehow. I've got to capture this as an instruction for future tests or something to say, do this. Have someone, when you get to a bit of rules, somebody just read it to yourself, summarize it for the group, play it, and don't. Instead of doing that thing where everyone tries to parse it perfectly, which is also useful, but I feel like it's more useful to see that process happen, that live summary thing. And this is something that happened last time we played Atlas Reckoning, Stras. Because of that process, and we talked about this a little bit over chat, it was on me to get it right. I read the fourth line instead of the third line in a table, and then communicated that to the group. And because they're new players, they didn't have any reason to think that what I was saying to them was crazy, and so they accepted my incorrect statement, and we went and played it, and then we were like, man, this is way too hard. What's going on? This doesn't make any sense. Oh man, we got to tell Stras these numbers are all wrong. And then when I reported it, he was like, no, it's the wrong line. You're using the wrong. You should have been doing this and not the third one, not the fourth one, or whatever. But that little hiccup of communication, and I think what you said in chat, Stras, was very wise as a game designer. Your response to me was, well, I need to make good handouts is what I need to do. And I think that little cycle of interpretation, misunderstanding, reporting, trouble in play, feedback is a really good cycle to encourage and capture. Obviously, with video, that's the best possible world, but maybe there's a way to do it in questionnaires or text that focuses players on reporting that little cycle of interpretation and reporting.
Yeah, the issue you brought up about reporting your interpretation of the text, it's really interesting to me because it feels like it builds on something we talked about a couple of sessions ago about how when we're writing the text, often we put an old draft aside and then write the new text directly from our brains, right? And it's what you're asking is the audience to do that step for you, right? Is to have played the game, have done this work of interpreting the text, and then to tell you what the text says, right? So it's almost like they're writing a new draft from their own experience of the game.
And most of the time, there's a phrase in that where you go, why don't I just say that? You know, the person is saying, well, basically, like, all these things on the sheet here, they're really just to figure out, like, what happens after the roll. So just put, like, your finger on one of the columns, and then we'll know that's the one you wanted. And then once we roll, we'll, like, move it up and down how we need it. And you go, oh, yeah, okay. I'll just write the rule like that. Why am I writing all this crazy text about the effect of the blah, blah, blah? Like, whenever someone says basically, like, whatever follows after that is usually what you should have said in the first place. And that's gold. Always gold.
Actually, what's really fun, since you mentioned AR, it's really interesting because one of the feedbacks that I got was actually, hey, it's nice that you wrote these rules, but can we get the summary? And so I went through and I redid a rule section into summaries, and everyone that I've shown it to is like, oh! And I was like, I should have done that in the first place. So.
Yeah, I definitely believe in, like, writing the 2-page version of your game and then seeing if that's the game that you should have written. Which is surprising how often that happens, actually. Or at least that becomes the new draft that you then flesh out again. But yeah, it's a pretty magical thing.
Who is it? There's a great game text. Is it Durance or there are too many games I can't remember. Someone has a great book, a game book that has a little, like, the first paragraph of every chapter says this is what this chapter is about in kind of a colloquial sort of conversational way, and then at the end of
Microscope.
Oh yes, it's Microscope. And the end of every chapter, he has a bullet list of everything from that section that he just told you. So good. So simple. That book is just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, while we're talking about Ben Robbins, like, one of the things that he does really well is usability design in a really, really, really serious way. And I think part of it comes from his intense brute force side play testing of the game, right? Is that he's put these materials in front of so many people and seen so many people go, like, I don't get it, that by the time you get to the final version of any of his games, that text is magic, right? You can't. There's basically no way to misunderstand things, right? People can still find ways. I mean, it's not foolproof, but it's pretty awesome.
It's one of the awesomest books. Actually, it's one of the only books that I find. So some books are really good at teaching you the game. Like, they put things logically in a pattern, and you read through them, and you're like, oh, okay, so this is what I want to do. But then later, when you come back to them and you're actually at the table, and somebody's like, hey, what was that rule? And you're just like, oh, and you have the classic, this index is terrible, and all this other stuff. So it's actually one of the most useful books at the table because you can almost instantaneously find exactly what you're looking for in it. It's just really marvelously put together. So back to the topic at hand. We should talk about playtesting. So I think there's actually an interesting thing that you guys were saying. Actually, it was John. He was saying, "Well, I asked for this, and I'm thinking about asking for this." And I think there's an interesting question here. I think that your finesse versus rock salt shotgun approach tested with everybody. I think sometimes that's also determined by playtesters, and who you can get and what you're willing to do. Because I know that uh, I don't want to. So I know John's playing, but I'm pathetically grateful whenever somebody's willing to not just go out and play my game, which is great, and that's what I want. That's why we make games, is for people to play them. But more importantly, when they're willing to spend time out of their day to come back and tell me about it. And so I'm always worried that if that I'm going to like ask for too much or put too much of an onus, and then people are not going to want to do it. And so I think a lot of the weirdness in playtesting comes from people not like, so for example, like if playtesters have like a culture and they know what is useful feedback, then you're going to be getting specific things. But instead of trying to teach every playtester those general principles, you have to kind of yourself rig the game and make a sub game, which I think is actually going back to that whole, this is a completely new process, and it's not game design in the sense of like we're making rules now and just playing with mechanics. So, or maybe it is just a very different kind.
No, that makes sense to me. From my side as a playtester, every time I've done it and really like followed through with it and given reports and done the harder work part of it, it was. Is this true? I think this is true. I might be lying, but I think it's true. It's because I was a big fan of the game, and doing that didn't feel like a chore. It felt like not quite the same thing as writing fan fiction, but kind of like that. Like this thing is really cool. I can contribute to it in some way. I want to be part of the project. I'm excited to write this report and give feedback, as opposed to, oh my god, I can't believe Stras is making me fill out this stupid questionnaire and asking me stuff. Well, how dare he, demand that I do work for him? It's more like, I love this so much. I want to tell you everything that happened. I want to tell you all about it. So when you're in that mode, and that's hard to get. I don't know if it's hard to get, but it's not a sure thing that you're going to find playtesters that are automatically like really excited about the thing. Although we talked about this last time too, I think that it's a bad sign if that doesn't happen at all. It probably means your game is not very appealing to people. But when it does happen, I think you can give yourself permission to ask for things and make some demands, because it is a fun process. People are excited to do it. They're on board. It's all fun in games. It's not really work. At least when you're in the honeymoon phase with it still, like 7 months later or a year later, in our case with Blades in the Dark, people can be like, come on, I'm tired. I've run 4 marathons, I'm out. But especially in the early stages, I think it's totally, I don't think you should worry about it, is what I'm saying. I think it's totally fine to ask for what you want and follow up with more questions if you didn't get what you needed from the first report or stuff like that. People are going to be excited to do it because they're fans of the game, I think.
Yeah, in some ways, I think the harder issue is if you're not in a local situation where you can play the game a lot yourself, right? Which is kind of the situation I'm in now in San Diego, actually. Is I'm new here. I have some friends. We can play some kinds of stuff. I could get a group together to do stuff, but I don't have the connections that I had in Seattle or even in Boston. And so I have all these new games that I've been working on, but some of them I haven't played yet, right? And I can't feel confident about them until I've played them a whole bunch, right? And so it was interesting that Stras brought up this issue, because when I was thinking about the different approaches to playtesting, I was like, so what are the restrictions that prevent people from doing this ideal playtesting that they might in a perfect world want to do? And the one I had for the sort of brute force approach was time and people, right? Like if you're going to playtest the game a lot externally and internally, it's a lot of time, right? So you're talking a year, multiple years. You don't really know sometimes, right, how long that can take. And for the finesse approach, the issue that I thought I have the hardest trouble with is if the intuitive approach, part of what you're trying to get with intuition is to have it feel right, to have it feel like you want it to feel. oftentimes like I'm the biggest impediment to that, right? Because I have this game, it's a good game, it's pretty fun to play, but it doesn't feel right yet, right? It doesn't do the thing that in my head I want this game to do, right? I'm this way with Geiger Counter for sure, right? I've designed 4 different versions of this game. It still doesn't do the thing that I wrote the game to do, right? At least in my experience of playing it. So I'm not satisfied with it, right? So even if lots of people play it, a lot of people like it, it's great. It doesn't do the thing I want, right? So that's kind of a different set of challenges from the can I get people to play it? How much can we play it? Do I have the time and energy and social network to do that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that goes back also to what we said at the beginning, where when you are releasing the alpha state or whatever you want to call it, and it's playable for a certain audience, that consideration gets less problematic. It's still an issue for you because you haven't made the Geiger counter you want. I haven't made the Danger Patrol I want, and we might never do that. There's no guarantee that we'll ever figure it out. But because there are versions available that people like, they can just happily keep playing them forever. And like I think Ben Robbins is one of the fundamentalist Geiger counter players. The original alpha is the best. And
yeah, he does. He still plays the first version.
Yeah, and he totally can because it's available. Anyone can get it who wants it. And it's while you're struggling with figuring out the perfect, getting that feel that you haven't found yet, the games that were failures along the way are playable, and they have their fans, and they that might be the only thing you ever do with it, as opposed to doing that all on your own in your designer dungeon or with your local group and never sharing anything, and then no one ever gets to play those because you haven't found that perfect snowflake version of the game yet. So I don't know. I think I'm not saying like everyone should share all their stuff all the time necessarily, but I think it takes a certain amount of pressure off when the thing you made that doesn't do what you want is fun. It's like, oh, I accidentally made a fun game. Darn. Oh no. What a disaster. You can't feel too bad about that.
Yeah, and sometimes releasing those drafts kind of lets me let go of the game for a while, at least, or maybe permanently sometimes, right? You're like, I made this game, it's pretty good, it's not what I wanted it to be, but, whatever, it is what it is, and I can always come back years down the road and write a different game that does the things that I want it to do, or a new version of this game, or, whatever. But it lets you be like, it's good enough for now, right? It can do the things, and it lets you kind of be like, because there's one thing where you're like if you have these sort of big white whale projects, you can't always be working on them because then you're never going to design any games, right? Like if you're never going to design the second game or the third game or the fourth game you were going to write because you're still working on white whale game or whatever. So like at some point you have to let go of that so you can design the other games that you're going to design, right? And whether that's temporarily or long term or whatever. And
yeah,
is a good way to let go.
Yeah, that's true, but I also think that like with Danger Patrol, I don't know how you feel about Geiger Counter, but for me, a big breakthrough with that was realizing it didn't have to be one game. That it's totally okay if there are 6 Danger Patrol games. And for a long time, I was trying to make the right version of it, and over time, I realized like this. What am I doing? Like the thing, my white whale thing is essentially Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon. Like that's stupid to say I'm gonna make the one game that's gonna do that the best. Like it's too big to get my arms around, I think. And once I realized that, deciding like, oh, okay, so it's this quick and easy little dice game. It's a card game. It's a board game. It's an RPG. It's whatever. It's a video game. It could be whatever. And it's just going to continue to produce. It's a brand. It's an IP or something that is going to spawn other stuff. And yes, there is still when it comes to the role-playing game, there is a thing in my brain that I want it to be that I haven't made yet, and that it's very specific, and I'm still trying to capture that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's fine.
I was going to say I definitely piggybacked on your solution there a little bit. I think maybe it was the week after you released Pocket Danger Patrol, I did a 2-page version of Geiger Counter that was like a kind of board card game thing, which I called Geiger Counter Hubris. And for me, it was this genius thing that was like, yeah, John's totally right. It can be like this like series of things rather than this one thing that I've been trying to throw darts at. And of course, I haven't released the final version of that either. But whatever. But it's definitely it definitely helped me let go a little bit, like watching you go through that process with a game that I think you feel similarly about. And even Restless, I think, has a lot of Geiger Counter in it, right? It has this like people in a horrific scene and people die at the end of most scenes, and there's a lot of the lessons that I learned from that process that have gone on into other games, and so I don't regret that process at all, and I'm glad that so many people enjoy playing it for sure, and maybe one of these days I'll release another game, but I think I've let go of it enough that it's okay if that doesn't happen, right? I'm happy with the things I've done and the things I've learned from it, right? And I can go on and make other stuff, and it's cool. So, so maybe one of the things we can talk about in terms of the beta process is sometimes it's cool that games just stay that way, right? And like that's the final version, right? That can be a lesson. That can be something you learn from it too, for sure.
Goes back to what you mentioned about who are you doing this for, and sort of what is your vision for the game, right? Because there's nothing wrong with writing a game just for your friends and then throwing it on the internet, being like, maybe some of you guys might also like it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that suits my particular laziness really well, and I love to champion that idea. But Stras, earlier you were getting to some really good like practical stuff, and maybe we could talk a little bit about that, like when you were talking about how you could break down your text and say, okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z. That's going to take me 3 hours. I can come home after work. I'll do that. When I finish that, I'm going to release the new draft. That's really good, like real actionable, tools to do this process. Maybe we can talk more about like stuff like that, like things we actually do to progress through this beta phase. There's playtesting, which we've come at from a few different angles, but there's also revising the work and versioning it and making decisions about what changes you're going to make and what out of playtesting, what you're going to reject, what you're going to keep. Is there any like thing that comes to mind immediately as like a thing you do that helps you advance that process?
So, let me see what I can organize my thoughts for a second here. So, actually, it's really interesting because the moment that you go into beta, and by beta I mean like you're not just playing with your group. I'm not talking about like an internal playtest, like that's alpha. But when you go into beta, you actually run into a problem that is interesting because there's 2 clocks, right? So there is the clock of when people need stuff by, and the clock of how fast you need to change things and sort of where you're seeing things going over a period of time. So, like, if I'm going to change things, I can't just reach over and grab the text that people are using right now and then just, shake it up every week. I mean, you can, and usually in the beginning that's something that people expect, but in general, you kind of want to put a stable version in front of people. And so one of the things that I'm starting to notice is that I'm dividing up my text into the sections and sort of like the tasks that I want to do. So one of the feedbacks that I got back was actually that my text was organized a little bit weird, and there were some suggestions about what I could put where to help learning. I was like, oh, this is actually really handy. How this is useful, and this is useful, and this is useful. I'm not so sure about that one, but the other thing is that for me, like for example, this week, like I know that I have to, like I'm finishing locations, which is a thing in the game, but like I know that I'm going to do a character sheet pass, so the abilities are going to get a little bit more polish to make sure that everything plays with everything else correctly. And there's a couple of inconsistencies in the 6-player game that I want to make sure that they're addressed and everything's smooth. So it's just one of those things, like you notice that you have these categories, and I'm like, all right, so we're going to spend one night, or we're going to go over like the feedback, and then I'm just going to read through everything, and I'm going to like write my own like sort of like, okay, address this, look at this, circle stuff, and then we're going to do like a one pass, and then I'm going to change the text, update it, and then when it's done, I'm going to do a push, and you're probably going to see a new version number. So for me, it's about organizing mentally categories, and then taking those categories and turning them into steps that you can follow, because revise the whole text is terrifying. You just look at like, so many pages and you're just like, where do I start? But when you have, again, going back to the concrete thing, when you've divvied up sort of like, work on one section at a time, work on one mechanic at a time, it becomes a lot more manageable and becomes a lot more concrete. So it's something that you can not just accomplish, but you can see the change sort of like in its position without having to change everything. Because if you're changing everything, you're going to generate a new set of problems and a new set of bugs that you're going to have to iron out and so on.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to bring up, this is not directly related from what you just said, is some feedback I just got recently was about assumptions I'd written into Restless about the number of players that can play it, which is actually really interesting, because oftentimes you give a range right at the beginning of your text. You're like, 3 to probably 8 can play this game, but oftentimes the playtesting doesn't happen at the extreme ends or at all of the different possibilities that it could happen, right? You think that the game is playable with 3 players, but maybe nobody's ever done that, right? And so one thing that I'm getting down to, one thing I write a lot shorter games, so in some ways it's easier to go through the whole text, but it is going through it and kind of looking at each sentence individually as a claim that somebody is making about this game, right? And thinking, is that really true, this thing that I wrote, right? When you, and it works for mechanics too, right? Like you think like, okay, so when they have a fight, the first thing they do is the text says they should do is this. Is that what I do? Is that really what I do when I have a fight? Or is the first thing I do, I'm like, oh, hey guys, so this is a fight now, right? And then we do a thing, right? Like there's a sort of a change in mode that happens or something, like there's always these things that we do without thinking about them, right? So I think one good mode is to go through and be like, make sure that the text actually matches the experience of real people in the game, right? Because that's pretty easy for you to kind of like move through that stuff like, la la la, oh yeah, I wrote this thing, it's probably fine, whatever, and then never go back and really consider it, right? In light of all the things that you've now learned about how the game works.
And sometimes playtesters actually give you back that feedback. It's kind of hilarious. I just got back some feedback where somebody's like, it's a lot more fun. So like, there are these behemoths which are like monsters, and they're like, it's a lot more fun if everybody makes them, and then when you draw them randomly, somebody's like, oh, that's my thing. Oh, that's awful. Why did I do that? And I'm just like, yeah, we actually do that on my table. Why didn't I write that into the rules? And so, yeah, exactly that. Going through and looking at that, I think is pretty stellar. It's half of what you're doing at a table is culture of play, and translating that into the text, I think, is half of the grace of writing rules. Not just making mechanics, but actually conveying what you want people to experience and do.
Absolutely. It touches on things we've talked about in past chats that boil down to what do you say? That it feels silly sometimes to get to that level because we're trying to sort of inspire the players to do their own thing. But I think it was Graham Walmsley. It might be in Play Unsafe, or maybe he just said it online. I forget. But he essentially made that appeal. Like, yes, okay, your game is about a dungeon crawl. Okay, cool. And this is my strength score. and this is how we determine if I hit in combat. All right, so now we're going to play. What do I say now? We're about to start playing. What do I say? What do I say to these people? They're all looking at me. What do I say to them? And it's such a simple question, but it's a beautiful one. And there isn't obviously one right answer, but those kind of graceful, I think is what you said, Strauss. That's a really good way to put it, that there are these transition points. You're going out of one mode and into another. You're starting cold, and you need to get everyone to like pay attention and focus on something. Polaris obviously has like really great tools in that space, and 1001 Nights also. But all games need those things that like transition us out of chatting into the game space, and then transition us from just talking about something to rolling the dice about it, and then transition us from the dice result to moving on out of that mode into just talking again. And yeah, all those little transition points. I think Luke mentioned this actually in his playtest essay. Recording yourself is a tool that I haven't done nearly enough, and I think it can capture some of these things that we're talking about, where you listen back and you go, oh, that's what I do when it's time to do a combat. I say these 3 sentences every single time. Maybe that should be in the book, and you don't realize you're doing it. So that can be really useful.
Yeah, I think, and talking about speech acts is a really important thing too. I think you mentioned a lot of this, but the idea that the text in the book is different from what people actually do at the table, right, is an important thing to remember. And one thing that Jackson and a couple of other people are really good at is making the text of the game something that actually gets read aloud, right? So you incorporate the artifact of the game into the play experience in a very direct way. It lets the designer kind of speak at your table in some ways, right, even though they're being conveyed by other people. And there's different approaches to that. Like, one approach is definitely that one. The other approach is to empower whoever's read the text through materials, through cheat sheets, through all sorts of stuff, to be able to convey that to other people. And this is another really key part to pay attention to, not just sort of what are you doing, but how does this whole thing even happen, right? Like, you have this book, and somehow it's going to become an experience, like at the table, right? Like, how does this transition occur? Who's reading the text? Is it just one person? Because then if it's one person, then that person has to do all the work conveying what this is and to the other people, right? Are multiple people going to read stuff? Are you going to have materials for individual players, right? What's on the character sheet? Like, are you going to be like John Harper and put all the rules on your character sheet so that way you don't have to have any confusion about who's supposed to read what, right? Like, there's all sorts of things you can do, right? But thinking about how people take this thing that you've made and then actually do things with it is also, I think, really critical.
It's an impressive skill. I don't want to gloss over it as a given, right? Like, and then you do this. Then you effortlessly explain to people how to recreate an experience with words on a page. Moving on. I agree that that's the challenge of our chosen hell to do this work. But man, it's not easy. And the game that just sprang into my head was Dogs in the Vineyard. Reading that text is an incredible experience as a role player, I think. It's the game designer talking to you directly, just person to person, like you're sitting there having a conversation with Vincent, and teaching you how to play the game, and telling you what you say when you play the game, and also building this like itch that you have to scratch while you read that text. Everyone who reads Dogs in the Vineyard has to play Dogs in the Vineyard because it's just so unsatisfying to read that book. He like walks you all the way to the precipice and then is like bye and just leaves, because that's the way Vincent's mind works, right? He knows he's perverse. He's toying with you through the whole text to make you obsessed with going to a town and being a dog, or creating a town and running the game. And that's one of the most beautiful game texts I think that we have. Monster Hearts is similar, but Dogs is a little shorter and more concise, and like it just, oh man, it does that thing we're talking about perfectly. If you want to see an example of what we're trying to say, Go read Dogs in the Vineyard. I think it hits all those in such a just incredible way. And Apocalypse World does too, but for a totally different kind of thing. Dogs does it in a way that's more instructive. Well, I don't know if it's more instructive, but I feel like it's something every game designer should read. It's just every time I read it, I go, oh, what am I doing? I should be doing it like this. This is a great way to do it.
Yeah. There's another game that comes to mind for me when thinking about this, which is a fascinating example because it's a game that's still in beta and hasn't been officially released, is Emily Caraboss's game Sign and Stranger, which is a fascinating game because over the course of the beginning part of the game, you create this alien world that you're going to go visit by drawing random things that you've written down, essentially, right? Like there's these association games you play to generate it. So literally there's no way for the game to tell you what the experience of play is going to be like because it's built off this random series of associations that you build up together as a group, right? And there's examples and stuff, but like the examples are totally different from what the actual experience of play is going to be. So it's one of those games where I read the text and I was like, well, holy crap, I got to play this game right now because it's kind of like you get half an experience, right? You're like, well, I kind of know what this is going to be like, but I mean, I think Microscope is similar, right? You have this structure that you're going to use to create this experience, but you're like, I mean, is it going to be a fantasy thing? Is it going to be this like history of this one family? Is it going to be about an ant colony? I don't even know, right? It could be anything, and it depends on, and Primetime Adventures is like this. It depends on when I'm sitting across the table from another player, and I say, hey, what about this? And then they say a thing, and that's what the game is about, right? And there's no way to know what that's going to be like until you actually do it.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Actually, Emily has a whole series of games that fall into that category. I think Breaking the Ice and Shooting the Moon are kind of like that too. She's very good at that. Something I wanted to call back to when Stras was talking about like practical tools, like working on one mechanic or cutting it down so you're not revising the whole text at once. That sounds to me like a very practical, like software engineering kind of approach. When I worked in that field, that's kind of the first thing you learn, right? Like if you're trying to test something and you change everything, you won't know what made it change, right? You try to change one thing and see the results of that change, and then iterate forward. That makes a lot of sense, and I think it applies to role-playing design.
That's what I do for a living.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. I think software design has documented a lot of its techniques in a really powerful way. That role-playing game design hasn't. So that might be a place to look potentially. I haven't read a lot of software design books, but I bet there are some good ones that might speak to this.
There's a lot of not just software design, but also if you read books on critique for like art and stuff, I think there's a lot of fields. Not to make this very zen and like you can learn something in everyday actions, but there's a lot of fields from which you can draw a lot of information that can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I wanted to highlight with that idea of trying to like tackle one mechanic at a time. Something I've had a lot of success with is if I'm struggling with a particular mechanic, that you can feel like trapped. Like the playtest is coming up on Thursday. I had a week to revise this thing, and I played Borderlands 2 instead, and I haven't done it, and the playtest is coming up again, and we're going to have the same crappy mechanic, so I better fix it really quick and figure out how to change it, and I need to make it awesome. It sucked last time. I don't know what to do. What works for me is just to take it out. If you know that mechanic is broken, you've played with it for a while and it's just not working for anyone, so you just remove it from the game. That mechanic is gone. You play that night, and whenever that thing comes up, you go, oh yeah, we don't have a mechanic for this anymore. So I don't know, like you get like you get a point of money from the guy. Write that down on your sheet that you got a point of money, and we'll figure it out later. Whatever. He pays you. The money system is all fucked up. Just write down that he paid you. We'll remember that for next time. And then if that mechanic persists in being broken for 8 weeks, and no one cares, then then you're done, potentially. You're like, oh, we don't need an economy. We don't need a money system in this game. It turns out the game is fine. You just say he paid you, and everyone goes, okay, fine. Or the opposite happens, and every week people go, come on, dude, we need the frickin' money system. We can't play this game without the money system. And that's really good feedback, too. You learn that this mechanic is somehow essential to the thing you're trying to make. And when you try to play without it, it feels wrong. Which isn't that wonderful. Like, if you could dream for a piece of feedback for someone to tell you, hey, this mechanic is essential, we really need this, like, man, that's wonderful to hear. And that's one way to find that out, is to just keep going without it. And I think that's one way to iteratively build a game. If you want, and we talked about this before, like starting with a core and then playing without all the missing pieces until you eventually build them and stick them on the game. But I think it can help designers, too, that feel stuck in that beta phase where they're like, man, I just cannot solve this problem with the game, and I just have to shelve it. And you have this window, you have a willing local group an external group within the beta phase who's willing to play test your game, and you're just going to like cut them off because you can't solve the economy problem. I feel like that's a mistake. I think it's way better to say, look, I don't know how this is going to work yet, but everything else is still there. So please just keep playing until I patch it or whatever.
That's the second clock I was talking about. You've got your own internal clock of when you have free time to work on a game, and that's the second clock, is you have a group, and you're not going to have a group forever. And, I mean, they might be willing to play test for 4, 6, 8 weeks even, but you're not going to have a group that's going to be play testing for you for 2 years straight, at your beck and call. So make the most of it, respect them, try and do what you can, and, when you hit the button on beta, there's a clock, so...
Yeah, and I want to talk about versioning at some point and sort of how you guys track versions, because I think that's a really important topic. But I wanted to go back while John was talking about taking mechanics out, and I think John and I have had a lot of conversations about this in reference to Apocalypse World in particular because of the Vincent's theory of the onion model. And I'll summarize it real quick for people who haven't seen our other video cast where we talk about this. But Vincent has this theory that maybe in Apocalypse World, maybe in all games, at the core, you have this sort of diceless kind of interaction that happens, right? Where I say a thing and then you say a thing, and then we sort of like have a conversation about it, right? There's no formal structures to it aside from the structure of the conversation that we're having about what's happening in the fiction, and then mechanics are sort of built on top of that, right? And I think one of the interesting lessons of this is that you don't need any particular mechanic necessarily, right, to be functional. And we can talk about John's economy example in a second, but that you can kind of remove any mechanic in your game as long as other mechanics aren't built on top of it. And then you can either replace it with nothing, like John says, in which case you just have a conversation about it. Like, you gave me some money, we're more wealthy, and next time we want to buy something, I can say, oh, you remember that guy who gave us that money? I'm going to use that money to buy the thing. Everybody's like, cool, right? And that's how the economy functions in the game, right? Or the other thing you can do as a placeholder, and sometimes even as a final mechanic, is write descriptively what happens, right? And don't write a mechanic for it. Just be like, when people give you money, usually you have to spend it right then because otherwise people will rob you for it, right? So when you come back into town, what you need to do is transfer your cash into some kind of movable or immovable goods, right? So like buy a house or like buy new armor or whatever. But that's what happens when you come into town with your money, right? And you write that descriptively. And then when people play the game, they get to that part, and then sometimes instead of finding this blank space where they make stuff up, which is fine, they at least kind of have a procedure to kind of know how it's supposed to feel like or how it's supposed to go, right? And usually they can wing it from just that, right? And sometimes that's enough to have the mechanic, right? You just write a little descriptive thing about it. This is how free-form games are built. These little descriptive things where you say, this is how you do the thing. So yeah, I think you can have placeholders for sure, which I think is another really important design tool. And they can be descriptive as well as being, hey, I don't know how this works right now.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And it also touches on related practical tool, I think, which is writing the. We talked about this before. Like, it's not so much putting it like not looking at the draft and rewriting the game rules from memory. It's more on a per mechanic basis. It happens to me all the time where when I'm in the beta phase, I'm so far away from that early stage when I was like authoring the tool itself, authoring the mechanic or the procedure or whatever. Now I have tunnel vision on describing to other people how to do it, and I sometimes get down this rabbit hole where what I need to tell you is pick one of these two things. And I've written 6 paragraphs about that because there's so many interesting things to say about it. And I haven't told you to pick one of these two things. And it's really easy to get into that mode where you're lost in the instruction of the thing. And I think it makes sense to back off. And even if you do have a mechanic that's working for you, to take this freeform design approach that Jonathan's talking about and just try to say it in the simplest possible way procedurally. Like, the point of this game is for your crew of criminals to move up the ladder of power in the city. And you do that by acquiring wealth. Like, that should be in the game somewhere. The alternative is to describe every system thoroughly and hope that everyone puts those systems together in such a way where that occurs. But it behooves you as a designer, I think, to find those places where you can just tell people what you're doing, and also then describe how to do it and the mechanics and all that stuff. But
right. And sometimes it's buried in like descriptive content, like, you are in the dark reaches of the undergrowth, and there's this evil lurking around you. You have the will to fight it, right? And what you really want to say is like, oh yeah, there's this dude invading, and you're gonna fight him and try to save people. Like sometimes it's hard. I mean, sometimes you do need to have the evocative stuff that gets people excited about playing your game, right? But you also need to tell people what they're doing, right? And sometimes it's easy to either, like you say, give them a bunch of rules text, or to give them a bunch of sort of poetic description and expect that they're going to read this and be like, oh yeah, totally. When you haven't actually told them what they need to do.
Yeah, and I think it also gives you it gave me permission, and this just happened recently with Blades in the Dark. We've been playing with this sort of faction tier system that no one else has been playing with for a while, and it kind of takes all the other groups in the city and ranks them on this big ladder and groups them by like what type of thing they are, if they're criminals or law enforcement or whatever. And the original purpose for it was for the group to record their relationship with the factions. Like, you have a +2 positive relationship, you have a -1 negative relationship, and you can kind of like do stuff to nudge your relationships with the various factions around the game. And that's what I intended it to be. And then, of course, very soon after I introduced it, the players were like, how do we get on the ladder? What do we have to do to get on the ladder? And I was like, oh, right, that's what this game is about. That's what the point of all this is you have your little fledgling group, and you want to move up in the world. That's the point of the frickin' game, and I've made a ladder that shows a hierarchy of the world, so of course you want to get on the ladder. And then they look at me and go, how do we move up the ladder? And I was like, oh god, this is just ridiculous. Like, of course, this is what the game is about. And once you say it in plain language too, I think it creates different incentives and different permissions within the game, where it used to be, before that ladder existed and before it was a measurable scoreboard, advancement in the game always had to come with perks. Like, why should I put money into the guild? What do we get? Do we get a +1 on the roll? Do we get better stuff? What do we get? And every single advance had to be power of some kind, like mechanical bonuses or something like that. And it became this leveling system problem to solve, which is an interesting problem to solve, and I spent a lot of time working on it. But once you put it in plain language and say, you're a group of people who want to get to the top of this ladder, this is what you want. Your characters want this. And I'm going to give you a path to get there that will involve ruining your lives and being, put in dangerous situations, and everything is going to suck for you on the way up this ladder. But the premise of the game is you create a bunch of characters that want that more than anything else. Then moving up the ladder is its own reward, and all those incentives and all those perks and things I felt like I had to build just melt away. And some of them are still, in the game, of course, but just backing out and taking that freeform description approach of saying, like, what are we doing? What happens when you impress someone or destroy your rival and move up the ladder? Like, that's what we're doing. That's the game. That's what we're trying to accomplish. So, in real practical terms, I think that is an excellent. In my own experience recently, that paid huge dividends, Jonathan, to look at it that way and to not try to keep going down the rabbit hole of, I need to rewrite this mechanic again, and taking that step back and going, wait, what is the point of all this? What happens when you play the game? I'm just going to tell you directly.
Right. Because it helps clarify what your intentions are, right? Both for individual mechanics and for the game as a whole, right? And that's, I feel like that's the most important thing of the whole process, right? Is getting clear in your own mind, what is this thing that you're doing, and then being able to convey that to other people. Like, that's the whole thing, right? And then everything else is just means of doing that. So if you already can describe what it is to other people that you want them to do in the game, you're like 50 or 60% of the way, right? So.
What do you think, Strash?
I don't know. It's kind of fascinating. I'm actually taking notes mentally, if nothing else. I think it's actually a really, really handy perspective to sort of as a way to approach rules. Writing rules is quite a science because you need to provide mechanical incentives for some things. But yeah, sometimes the premise of the game is really important just to vocalize. And that's actually something that's really interesting, is because I've actually, some of the feedback on the text that I've gotten is, can we get a summary of this? Or can you tell us what to do here before we actually have to read through 15 pages of rules for it? So I think people definitely want that. And so it's something that's important to look for, an opportunity to just say it.
Yeah, I think so. I started working on that just before this call, actually. I started doing summaries of various parts of the game yesterday and today, but the thing that I don't have, which is weird because I had it in earlier drafts and it kind of got away from me. I need to go back to the one page that tells you, like, from start to finish when you play this game, this is what happens. You start here and you do this and this is where you get in just a concise, like, full thing, and it can refer to other mechanics or whatever, but having that sort of summary of the whole process as a thing, and Microscope again does this really well. It starts just like the game itself. It starts really big, and then it takes you into all the bits and works down into the smaller regions. But just having that in your brain when you start, that okay, this is what we're doing. We're first level adventurers. We're going to go into dungeons and kill monsters or avoid them as much as possible. Take gold to level up, and we're just going to do that over and over again until we're level 20, and then the game is over. Just knowing that is really important, right? Because then when you go to play the game and there's a chance to get gold, you go, well, fuck, we get the gold. That's what you told us. That's what we're doing. We're getting the gold. And if you skip that phase and you just try to get at it with, you get XP for gold. My friend Ryan is running D&D for the first time, or was running D&D. He switched to World of Dungeons pretty quick, but he tried to convey this to the group, like, you're scoundrels, you get XP for gold, gold is the thing, but he didn't really sell it super hard to them, I think, because he keeps putting it in front of them, like, well, there's this massive treasure in this vault, but they say a demon guards it. They're like, forget it, we're not going in there. that sounds dangerous. And they just keep passing up. They find this huge treasure, and they're going to turn in for XP, and he's like, well, there's this like villager guy. He says it's rightfully his heirloom, and he wants you to give it to him for nothing. And they're like, oh, what a nice man, we give it to him. If they had that core summary, or more ideally, and World of Dungeons does not do this, you'd have a game where your character creation created characters that were just set up to do that thing, that they were, at the end of character creation, you had successfully created a scoundrel obsessed with gold. And then the rest of the game would follow, and it wouldn't be like pulling teeth to get everyone to go get their gold.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of mechanics are like that there is, like you say, mechanical incentives are super important. But they all have to kind of funnel into that premise, that plain language. This is what we're here to do. This is the point of things. And when you have that, I think you can tell more easily where the mechanics are fighting you. Oh, we're supposed to be doing this thing, but why do we have rules for like starting a family and having children? Like, that's totally not. That's messing up our gold obsession. That's not. We shouldn't have that. So yeah, I don't know. That like really strong premise is something that you need to get into the beta phase, but then I think it's what happened to me anyway. That recently is I forgot about it. I let it kind of drift away, and I needed to keep it front and center as I went into that process, because I was so focused on teaching the game mechanics that I kind of left behind that core simplistic notion of what the game is.
Because what happens is playtesting clarifies what the game's about, right? I mean, and that's part of what happens during the alpha phase. And so you've written these things already that say what the game's about, but they may not be true anymore, right? Because you have this clear vision of what the game is, right? And subsystems are the worst about this. I think the classic example is the feat system in D&D 3 or 3.5, right? Like, if you're a beginning character, how do you choose feats, right? What it says in the rulebook is you can choose any feat that's appropriate for your character that you're not restricted by, right? But people who played a lot of D&D 3 know for a fact that the feats you choose are super important to everything that you do later in the game, right?
Right. That's not the procedure. The procedure is, here's the level 1 to 20 worksheet, fill out all the feats for the rest of your career.
The build.
Yeah, that's how you do it. If you just pick your feats at first level from the list, you're an idiot. That's the worst thing.
Right. And I remember this happened in Platinum games when I was growing up too, right? Everybody takes boxing as a skill because it gives you an extra attack. And you're like, it's the best thing you can possibly have for a skill, right? Why
well, it also raises your PE or whatever.
Your strength by like significant amount, yeah.
And that also can give you more skill points, which then you can spend on another skill, which also raises your stat. Which, right. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Where if you've mastered the system, you know how you really do it, right?
Yeah.
But people and there is, I mean, people design games intentionally this way, so that there's a kind of expert knowledge that emerges as you sort of gain mastery of it, right?
Yes.
And some of that's to a certain extent good if that's the kind of game that you're designing, right? But you also want to.
But sorry, Jonathan, to interrupt. Like to our point, the game could say that. It could say, hey, listen, this game is a challenge about character building, and hidden in these next 2 chapters is an optimal build, and you should go look for it. Go find it. That's the point of this. That's what we have set out for you to do. And they don't say that. No. And they might as well, because that's what you're doing.
Right, and it's not like there's one optimal build, right? There's optimal builds for the kind of thing you're trying to do, right? If you're like, I'm going to be a flaming sword tank dude or whatever, like there's the feats that you should take because eventually you're going to level up and you're going to be flame tank masterclass or whatever, and you're going to have those prereqs, right? So you better take that now, right? And it's okay that they don't tell you that that they don't give you the spreadsheet for this is how you build master tank. But
that would ruin the fun.
That's a thing that you have to engage as part of playing this game, right?
Yeah, and being explicit about that, being direct about it, doesn't hurt the experience of doing it. It doesn't ruin it to say, we're all going to try to make the coolest builds we can to slay monsters and have the highest DPS possible. Like, that's cool. Like I play Diablo 3 like all the time. That's all I do is like tune my DPS by another 1,000 per second through elaborate means, and it's super fun. But you might as well be upfront about it, and it could be a case where those that isn't the point of Palladium Fantasy, perhaps, and that's not what they intended you to do at all, and they're appalled that people do that. That's completely possible, and the amount of playtesting that it requires to get to that point, particularly, and Atlas Reckoning is a good example again, I think, where because it's a GM-less, it's a board game to some degree. Like it's a role-playing game, but it needs the robust cooperative board game spine inside it, because there's no game master who can be like, well, yeah, they're a little tougher or they're a little weaker, or do any of that kind of business. It has to have this really like strong mechanical core that is very closely tuned. One of the great strengths of the game is that it, as we discovered when we got it wrong, it's every fight is a winnable or losable fight, and if you pick the wrong one, you picked a not winnable fight. In our case.
To be fair, you started with fresh characters that didn't advance.
No, we did everything wrong. We did everything wrong. We totally blew it. But I think there's a big difference between a game that does have that like discoverable mechanical solutions versus games that don't. And when you're designing a game that has those, I think that might be a stronger indication of the many iterations brute force playtesting method may be what you need to do, because this happens in video games all the time, right? They release a game, they feel like they playtested it as much as they could, and when it's released to the masses on the second day, the hardcore players have realized, like, oh, you always take a knife because that increases your speed by 15%, and then when you unequip it, you keep the speed boost. So you get a knife, you drop it, then you get the SMG, and that multiplies the speed boost, then you drop it, then you get this thing, and they just discover these exploits that the only way to find those is by having 8 million people, play your game. So yeah, I think we're lucky in role-playing games, generally speaking, where we can lean back on human judgment. We can put some of those things in the hands of, revision or massaging at the game table. But those mechanical choices have got to be spot on if that's what you're building your game on. You need to find those exploits, or it behooves you to try as hard as you can to find them, I guess is what I mean.
The other thing is you can actually, so this is something that my other friend John LL talks about a lot, is you can actually, this is interesting, and this comes from programming, is you can count how many core mechanics and points of contact you have, and you can actually run a curve that tells you roughly how many playtests you need before you can feel confident that you've shaken down a number of things. So
that's really
certain
cool.
games, yeah, certain games need like only 6 playtests, and some games need like 200. Like if you're talking about something like exactly what you're talking about, like 3.5 needs thousands of people playtesting. So, it's a lot. But I mean, it's a smaller number than most people assume, because it's a lot like the Nielsen ratings. You don't need quite as many as many people, as many playtests as you think you might need. But yeah, so that's
yeah. I don't think we're designing games that need the level of playtesting that a hardcore video game requires at all. But there is that spectrum of you don't want to rely on something as simple as a 1.5 multiplier that makes your game irrelevant. You don't want to be in that position where everyone goes, oh well, we'll just keep doing this because every time we do it we get 1 million gold, so let's just do that. So yeah, I don't know. It's the more I have these conversations over the years, the more I realize the appeal of role-playing game design, because it touches so many disciplines achieving mastery of it is very challenging. And whenever we talk about this, I find a whole new branch of something like, oh yeah, that's a whole field of study. It's another hat I have to wear, I guess, is what I'm saying, as a role-playing game designer. Statistical analysis being one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I think some of it has to do with the kind of game you're designing, for sure, though, right? And the capabilities that you have, because like if you're making certain kinds of games, you really have to know how to run spreadsheets on probabilities, right? To know, this is the curve of results that I want, and this is the mechanic that's going to achieve it, and this is how it scales with levels, and this is how, all of that stuff. This is how it happens with multiple players as opposed to single players, like all that kind of stuff, right? And thank God I don't design those games, because I would be really, really terrible at them, right? I think for some to a certain degree, like part of the reason I'm attracted to freeform design is because it requires the things that I'm really good at, which is thinking about people and conversations and cultural norms and practices and how those build up into patterns of play and that kind of stuff. Like the stuff that I feel like I'm good at. And the interesting thing is, like, as indie game designers, right? You can't be good at everything, right? And sometimes you want to design games that are outside of your core comfort zone, which is totally awesome, right? And sometimes that involves learning a little bit about a thing that you didn't know about, or trying to acquire a skill set a little bit, which is fine. And sometimes it just involves, like, doing the best you can, right? And I think both of those are totally viable approaches, right? So.
Absolutely. I want to get to this. We actually got a question on the feed. I know, right? It's a miracle. As if, I don't know his real name. I know he posts on Story Games a lot. See him there. Hello, whatever your real name is, or whatever your handle is. As if. He says, great point so far. I'm a big fan of examples, and writing an example of play can be sort of an imaginary playtest. And I totally agree with that. Every time I go to write an example, which I do very rarely because it's so hard to do. For me, it's one of the hardest things. Little tiny examples, like a sentence of something someone might say at the table, totally fine. But when I'm like, okay, time to write an example of play, man, it's hard to do for me.
Hire someone.
Maybe I should probably hire someone to do that. It's a good idea.
My friend Bree had a lot of trouble with this. She wasn't going to put out her game because basically this was one of her stumbling blocks, and I was just like, no problem, it's going to be done. And then, like, 2 weeks later, she had them. And so if this is a stumbling block, you have a lot of supporters and a lot of people that would be willing to do it. And what's really interesting is twofold. One, it's playtesting, because you are actually going to see what people are interpreting your rules as saying, and you can be like, oh, yeah, flamethrowers don't work like that. I need to rewrite that. And two, as people do it, you're seeing both kind of what people are looking for, and again, a little bit of my programmer is going to be showing, how to address corner cases, like what happens when there's a tie, what happens when somebody rolls 0 of something or 1 of something else. And so I think having somebody that is used to either writing or putting together good examples is helpful in many ways, because one, playtesting, two, provides you with material to use. So don't be afraid to ask. Actual play reports are basically examples, and if you can ask for those, then this is something else you can do.
Yeah, I have a practical example. My friend Wilhelm, who's a programmer, wrote the example in Agon. He from start to finish, and revised like 2 mechanics when he did that. So yes, you're right. That is a very good solution, and I'll probably ask you to do that. For Blades in the Dark, Stras.
Yeah. Another good approach is actually using transcriptions of real play. You can either play in chat form, right, which gives you a text to work from, which is amazing, or you can play in some other kind of recorded session and have to transcribe the whole thing, which is something you could pay other people to do, because people do pay other people for transcription for sure. But the thing that's really cool about real examples from real play is sometimes they're just way better, like on a very objective way, right? Because you have different people with different brains thinking of things that you're not going to think of, which for one is really brilliant. And the other thing, like Stras says, is you get people struggling with your rules, right? Which is a really, really cool thing to include in text. And it's one of my favorite parts of Apocalypse World, actually, is where
Me too.
Vincent is like, here's some people doing this rule in a way that's really bad, right? Or here's them trying to do it in a bad way, but then correcting and doing it the correct way, right? To show how these things actually work, right? Because in real life, nobody plays a game perfectly every time, right? And so you want to show examples that show people messing up or trying something and realizing why it doesn't work, and then trying something else, right? Like it's a living process, and as much as you can capture that process in something fixed like a text, I think it makes it a more rich experience.
Absolutely. And since we are talking about the beta phase, there's no excuse really. Like, you have external playtesters, they're reporting their AP. Somebody's probably willing to write an example or something like that. Like that seems like a really smart part of the beta process to ask for that. Like you said, Strauss, like I'm asking for stuff, I might as well ask for that too.
Oh, I'm totally stealing. I'm totally stealing. You posted a very detailed step-by-step. This is how the engagement phase works, and so that's going to become a flowchart so that people can reference it, during game. So.
Yeah, and that was a thing. That was a very practical thing where I discovered I had to tell everyone how to do that, and there was no list of actions. And you get into that mode and you realize, like, oh wait, I thought I knew how to do this, but now I have to walk you through the process, and shit, maybe I'm wrong. And it does get into these nitty-gritty things with games sometimes. Again, board game design. Someone posted on Google Plus the other day, everyone should design a board game. Every game designer should design a board game. I think that's probably true. Because you get into those things where you say, okay, the mechanic is you draw cards, and then you choose the 3 and put them in front of you, and then you compare them, and the high ones beat the low ones, and then you take that number of points and you move that many spaces on the board. Okay, great. What happens to the cards we just played? Oh, well, you discard the ones that got beat. Well, you didn't tell me to discard you didn't tell me ever to discard those cards. And once you get down to that level of like nitty-gritty, someone outside your brain has to do the process, you realize all those things come out. You discard them, duh. You didn't say to do that. As far as I know, they're still sitting there. But that's a diversion. I was thinking of a particular thing. Oh, right. The idea of real-world examples and using chat transcripts and stuff. I think that's really smart. Bigger picture, practical question. Do you have an intuitive feel, or is there a real procedure here of deciding like how to edit that? Like, what do you show? What particular things do you highlight? You obviously can't put a 4-hour session unless you're doing a replay style cool comic book, but like how do you go about that process?
Replays and the culture of replays is pretty big. Actually, Jonathan, go ahead. I saw you start.
Go for it. I was going to say that I don't know.
For me, it's easy, actually. One of the things is that you don't need to transcribe a whole session. Most people don't have questions about the whole session. The single most useful thing that playtesters can give me is questions. So if I write a mechanic and they ask me a question, I'll rewrite the mechanic. And if they ask questions again, I won't rewrite it 4 or 5 times. I'll stop and I'll write an example. And that usually solves it. Yep. So watch for that. That's like a very practical thing. Like, watch for people asking over and over again about a specific thing, and then put an example there, and just watch their question stop. It's like magic. So and then of course, you don't need to write a whole session You need to write a whole scene. And a great example of this is in Monster Hearts. Obviously, like the very practical, this is what a scene in Monster Hearts looks like. And I think that's one of the things that I want to do is like, I don't know that I need to do an entire engagement start to finish, but I can do like, you know, one round, and once people see that, I think that they'll be able to pick it up and run with it. So
yeah, this is one thing I need to do for Restless, actually, is write an example of how to play out a card. So I'm going to watch this later and steal all of our good ideas about that. But one thing that I was thinking about, too, is the issue. So I remember the example of play that comes to mind when talking most about long-form examples of play is the one in Nobilis, for me. And the interesting thing about the one in Nobilis is that it's really awesome, but it's really hard to generalize from. And one of the issues I think a lot of people had with Nobilis second edition is that they didn't really know how to go from the text of the book to actually playing the game. It was that sort of like, oh, what do we do, what do we say now issue that John was talking about earlier. And to a certain extent, the example helps with that. But one of the interesting things about the example is it takes place multiple sessions into an ongoing game, and it misses the sort of crucial part at the beginning where you're like, you know, like the first things you say after you make characters, right? What is the game about? What are we doing? What is the first scene, right? Which I think is something that a lot of people have trouble with, right? Unless you tell them specifically, the beginning of the game is really core and crucial to get right. And the other thing about the example that came out of the community after people were talking about it is one of the things that it has in it is a extended fight scene that takes up a large portion of the middle part of the game, where there's all sorts of amazing stuff that happens. People jump on top of frozen explosions, and this one guy like cuts open the sea with his like hook hand. It's unbelievable, and it's so striking. And one of the interesting things about it is that Nobilis is not really about fight scenes, right? And it's in the book and in the example because they knew that people would have them because it's a game, right? But it's not reflective of what the game is about, kind of, right? So it's an example that illustrates a thing, but then it also biased a lot of people's experience of the game, thinking, oh, we have to have these awesome fight scenes where you jump on explosions. So there's the good and bad things about modeling stuff. If you model stuff, it sticks in people's mind, and they'll do it a lot, right? So I think being intentional about how you select those examples is important, though I'm not sure I have a really principled way of going about how to do that.
I think Strauss's method is pretty good to say that you don't necessarily start out knowing ahead of time what your examples should be, but you discover them through the friction of playtesting, and you need to write them to help people navigate problems that they're having with interpreting the rules. That seems like a really practical approach to me, instead of saying, okay, I need to start out by writing a whole example of play, which is probably a pretty decent exercise to do. I wouldn't argue against that. But to feel like you have to do that may not be true. But going through the process and then discovering, like, okay, I've answered your question. That didn't suffice. Now I need to write an example. Okay, now we're good. That's good. That feels really solid to me. I guess the obvious question at that point is the failure state. At that point, when the example doesn't solve the problem, I guess you have to go back to other types of solutions. Maybe the mechanic itself is the issue, or yeah, I don't know. It's more murky, I guess, at that point. If the example doesn't clear it up,
you need to perform an external playtest that you're observing. It's the video that you're talking about. If you notice that only one group is having trouble with this, it might be something about them, but if you're seeing these angles come up and you've tried to revise and you've tried to answer the questions, something is being miscommunicated. So that's when you need to ask people to summarize it in their words or to show you what happens at a table, and you need to not actually teach it, but observe it. And then that will, or at least for me, that usually is the point at which I'm like, okay.
I think that's really smart. Something Luke says in his essay is, and I think a lot of software and design people know this already, but people are very bad at telling you what actually occurred. People are bad eyewitnesses, for one thing, and then people are bad at reporting their feelings and thoughts. And we depend on that so much in playtesting. There is a bit of game design, like Strauss was saying earlier, to tricking people into reporting well by giving them questions or leading them in some way to actually give you the information you want, because the way they answer questions might not really be that revelatory, or they might be lying without realizing that they're reporting false stuff. So yeah, I think since we live in the perfect time for this, it makes sense to just cut to the chase and say, look, just do a Hangout, record your game, let me watch it. That's probably a really powerful way to just cut through all of that stuff instead of trying to come up with the perfect questionnaire that gets people to report more accurately. Watching them play just can't be beat, and especially in that form too. Like, because I've before Hangouts, I've done a lot of playtests where I've just been in the room as a silent observer, and that's been really useful. But it's not the same thing. There is an effect, no matter how quiet you try to be. It's just different. So being able to do it over Hangouts or whatever is such a great solution. Might as well demand that first if you can get it.
Yeah, we're reaching the 2-hour mark, so I wanted to raise 2 issues maybe that we can talk about. One is version control. We talked about versioning a little bit earlier, and the other one is how do you know when you're done? And those are kind of maybe related questions, right? How do you know which version is the last version? And does the process change as you get closer, right? The things that you're doing to the document, right? That kind of stuff. So I would raise that before we,
Yeah, that's good. Those are both really good before we wrap up. I'm sure our programmer friend has smart things to say about version control, so I'm not going to try to do that too much, except to say that I've had a lot of success, or some degree of success, with doing this kind of like parallel evolution where I have an out, like this happened with the Wildlings, it happened with Danger Patrol, Blades in the Dark currently. I think there was some other games that did this too, where I get things to a point where I'm happy with them, I put them out, and people start playtesting that version, but my local group is playing and iterating and playing and iterating and playing and iterating, and we're going down this totally other branch on the tree of evolution, and everyone else is still playing the thing that we have diverged from, and they're coming up with problems and solutions from this that are similar, but they're always going to be different, and I end up with these like divergent tracks, sometimes that are very close together, sometimes that are really different, and I've sort of like followed the local track, sometimes into completely different games that we discover, like, oh, this is a whole other game that's really fun. This should be something else, and that's really cool. But for me, the version control and stuff, I don't know. I'm not really like as meticulous about it as I could be, probably. But the way I've found a lot of use for it is to get to this divergent point and discover, okay, either we have to go back to our common ancestor. That's where things are really working. And this whole iterative branch just is lost. Like, we had fun doing it, but the common ancestor is where things were fun. So let's go back to that and then catch up to where everyone else is in their other mode. Or to say, well, we've discovered a bunch of cool things here. Now it's time to like hybridize the paths and take the best things that the external playtesters have discovered and the best things that we've discovered on our weird exploration, and create a new hybrid, and then be okay with the idea that we're starting the beta over essentially with this hybrid, and we're going to do it again and see where this goes. And that's been very productive for me as a process. It's led to solutions that weren't obvious from that common ancestor game. The hybrid solutions were the ones I needed, and the way I found them was by evolving these two separate paths. So that's not really version control or versioning per se, but it's a weird approach to it that I kind of did accidentally that I had some success with, and I think it's worth trying.
So I'm gonna actually stymie John here and say that version control for games is different for me because I actually diverge from programming recommendations. And so what version control for me in design is about communicating with your playtesters. So if you see that I have put out version 4.2 and then you see 4.2.5, what that means is you should probably check the FAQ or the notes that tells you what the difference is between the text that was previous and this one is. You don't need to make new assumptions. Maybe I've changed the cost of a power from 1 to 2. Maybe I've just tweaked a little bit, like the wording of one thing to clarify it, right? When I need you to understand that like we're going to go past this point, I'll usually like jump up a number like big. Like instead of going like 422, 423, I'll be like 45, 475 or something like that. That basically means like, whoa guys, there are some mechanical changes. You need to pay attention to this. It's mostly the same, but you got to kind of look at this. The moment that I actually communicate, hey, we're going from 4 to 5, what I'm actually saying is you need to read the text again. Like there are enough changes here that you can no longer rely on all your past assumptions. Just read it again. And so that's essentially the shorthand for my stuff. Because what I've noticed is that whatever is in my mind and convenient for me for version control has nothing to do with how people are perceiving it. So what I instead just shifted to thinking was, if I just throw some numbers up, how do people feel about them? Like, what happens when you log into a community where, like, the link to your playtest is up in the corner, and what happens when, you see the number change? Like, what does that communicate to you? And so that's sort of the shorthand that I use. Does that answer your question?
I think that's awesome. That's really good. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I talk about version control, one of the things I wanted to talk about was I think it's great, Stras. Thanks for that. One thing was well, two different things. One was our experience playtesting Night Witches, which was really interesting. So we played 3 different drafts maybe of Night Witches over the course of playing it, and that wasn't anywhere close to all of the drafts that existed. There were multiple drafts that existed before we started playing it. There were multiple drafts, I think, after we stopped playing it, and there were also multiple drafts in the middle of our playtesting run that we didn't play. And one of the interesting things about our group, was me watching the vibe in the group about whether we were going to change to a new version or not. And it was really interesting because sometimes we would be like, yeah, I don't know about this game. Like, I don't know if we're going to keep playtesting it. It's like, it's just not doing stuff. And then we'd be like, oh well, we should upgrade to the newest version, and then see if we still want to quit, right? And then we would upgrade to the new version, and we'd be like, hey man, this game is so much better. It's amazing. Like Jason's fixed like at least 90% of the problems that we had with it or whatever. And then at one point it got to the point where we were like, we could upgrade from version whatever it was to version 0.5, whatever it was, but it's basically going to be the same game, and we're having a good enough time with it that we don't really want to upgrade it, and like the issues that we have with it are ones we can smooth over ourselves. And at that point we were just basically playing the game and not playtesting it anymore. We were like, this game is good enough, we'll just play it until we don't want to play it anymore, and then we'll stop, right? And that was a really interesting experience to witness, because I don't think I'd ever. Oftentimes I would be the one pushing playtests of my own stuff, and I would be pushing people up to the next version or whatever. But it was interesting to watch our group, since it wasn't a game that I designed, go through that process of thinking about versions. And the other thing that comes to mind is Vincent's first release of Dark Ages for Apocalypse World. And John probably has some thoughts about this, because they're playing a version of Dark Ages right now that has maybe some vague relation to whatever the thing Vincent wrote in the first place. But they've kind of moved beyond playtesting into some other realm. So maybe he can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I would love to. It's Vincent's fault. I'm going to blame him first and foremost, and Meg. It's both of their faults. We got the first version, I think. I mean, the first version they shared with us anyway, and fell in love with it and hated it too. Just despised it to a huge degree, which Vincent did too, ultimately. But we were so in love and hate with it. It was just a powerful thing. We made characters, and this is why we are still playing and why we're so obsessed with it. Character creation was amazing, and the playbooks were wonderful, and that's still true. The rest of the game has come almost up to the level of the playbooks. It's getting really close now, but in the beginning, only the playbooks were good, really, in my opinion, and the rest of the game was just not working at all. But the people I play with, Paul and Shannon and Sage, they're so good at making because we game together so much, usually with me GMing. They're very, very good at, if you give them the right tools, they can create a trio of characters that you just cannot wait to see what happens to them, and more than likely they're going to be at each other's throats and just create this amazing triangle of problems and passions and betrayals and deals, and it's just going to be really cool. And Dark Ages gave us this amazing set of characters that let us do our thing the same way we did with Apocalypse World, the same way we did with Warhammer and all the other games we played. Undying. So we fell in love with the Dark Ages world, which is basically the same as it's always been through all the iterations, and the characters, which are also kind of the same. The mechanics, though, the moves, were a kind of disaster at the beginning. And right out of the gate, we tried to use them, and they were really bad. So we wrote Vincent and said, hey, this isn't how you hack Apocalypse World. You know, like this is just not. I know you haven't done it very much, but we've done it a lot, and we're just going to go ahead and do our own thing here. We're going to make our own moves out of this and do what we're doing. And he said in the playtest text, he said, look, sorry, it's not in the text. Sorry, that's totally wrong. It was in an email. In an email, he said, if you come up against anything in the game you don't like, you know what you're doing, just write your own things and keep playing. That's what I want you to do. It's on the record. So we were like, can do, we'll do that. So over time, we've rewritten the whole basic move set. We've rewritten a bunch of the playbook moves. Not as much, because the playbook moves are mostly pretty good. And we're very deep into this campaign now, and our campaign is not about what Apocalypse World Dark Ages is about. So it's just not, there's no way as a playtest group, like this experience you're talking about, Jonathan, where you're like trying to identify when you change versions and how you navigate that process. This is the far extreme case of not only will we never change versions, but every week in the car ride, Sage and I are like, this is getting different enough. Like this should probably be a game. Like maybe we should just make this game. You know, we're so far away from what Vincent is doing now that, and we love what we're doing so much. We should probably just make this, because he's not making it. Clearly, he's decided not to make a different game. So yeah, there's absolutely no going back for us. But that's a success story. I think successful for our group and successful for Vincent to see how what he presented us with led us in this direction that he was totally not going in. We ran it off with it thinking we were doing what he intended, and his goals were very different from. And the current version is much more in line with those goals, and it's actually really cool. I would love to play the current version, honestly, but it was a useful playtest, and it created a fun game for our group that we're going to play for another year at least, probably. But I feel like there's a real difference between doing that as an external playtest group, which is what we are, and doing that as a designer with your local group. because when that happens with the local group, that is not like a win-win situation where the group gets a fun game that they're really enjoying and the designer learns a lesson, because you can't really do that. The designer can't be like, okay, I guess we'll play this broken, weird version of my game for a year now. You can't do that. You have to be like, sorry, everybody, I'm bringing a new one next week, so kiss all these characters goodbye. And that's hard. That's hard to do. It's hard to ask people, like, show up and give me the gift of playtesting for free as all this goodwill you're giving me. Invest in my game and care about it. And also, I'm just going to wreck it over and over again for no compensation. You're not going to get anything out of this. You're just going to suffer through having your character rewritten and not getting to play the character you thought you were playing. And yeah, I think it's good to maybe warn people about that as part of the process, as the local group. But then as the external groups, as a designer, I think you have to let them go. You have to say, yeah, keep playing version 3.2, or keep playing Alpha Geiger Counter if that's what you're into. Like, you've given me a gift already. You've helped me out, and if you're obsessed with this and want to play this for the next year, I'm not going to step in and say and demand that you update to the new version. That crosses the threshold of asking for things, I think, as we talked about before.
I think the idea that you playtest for a while and you're willing to turn through the mechanics, and then the game takes on a life of its own, and you don't want to wreck everything that you have in order to just provide feedback. I think that's a cycle that a lot of groups go through. I've seen it happen a lot of times, in groups that I run, and so I think it's something that you have to kind of account for, and that's why, like, completely open design and completely open betas can sometimes be difficult, because if you're designing in the open and you're changing your game so radically, so frequently, it can be a bit rough, particularly because you need to get a fresh batch of people in who are willing to grind the glass, on the next set of mechanics when the groups that have been playing for a while are stable and they don't want to switch, or they've hacked their own system or whatever. And I think that there are some approaches, like John, I don't know if you want to talk about switching erasers and doing parallel processing with the same system in two settings. And I think that there's, but yeah, it provides a very interesting challenge. I think it's telling when you choose to actually activate the beta. And I think that what Jonathan said about how you got a rule set and it was okay and it was playable, but it had some problems, and then the next rule set totally fixed like 90% of them or whatever. And I think, but at its core, I think the game probably remained pretty consistent. And so, like, that's one of those things, is like you have to kind of get to a point where your game is, like, your home group might be willing to put up with doing some weird stuff, and sometimes you need to take breaks and come back to it later. But I think that's an important thing, is like you put out the beta sort of when you know that it's not going to change like completely, like we're oscillate, radically between each version.
But how do you know that? I mean, I think both John and I have had the experience of putting out a beta and playing it for a while and then being like, now this is shelved, like the next version is going to be totally different, right? Or like getting fed up with the process. I think part of the difficulty is time, right? Like you like you said earlier, you often can't version as fast as people are playing the game, right? So if you're and you don't really have any control over the playtesting timeline in a lot of ways, right? Like, I've definitely released betas that only got regular play like 6 months to a year after I released them, or sometimes even longer than that, right? And so I couldn't really start that process until that was happening. And then once it started happening, I was moving on to other stuff. I wasn't versioning the game anymore. I'd sort of let it sit for a while. So I think part of it is like, how do you even think about this process, right? And it sounds like your approach is really different from mine. My approach is to sort of make a beta, release it out into the wild, people play it for a while, and then I come back to it when I feel like it, right? But you have a much more like deadline-oriented, this thing is going to get versioned while people are playing it approach. And I think that's really cool if you have external groups that are like keeping you updated about when they're playing stuff, and like you can go along with them, right? But sometimes people's timelines are really not in sync, right? Like people sometimes need 6 months to find a hole in their schedule to play test your game because they're already playing other stuff, right? And that's been a challenge for me for sure.
Well, sometimes that's good because maybe they're coming in on a version that you need testers for. So I think maybe one of the things that you can do, I'm just throwing this out because we're discussing, is reach out to a group you know would be willing to play for you, and instead of just, so like one of the things that I'm doing is I'm doing a closed beta and then an open beta, right? So like the closed beta is basically people I know that I've reached out to that I'm expecting maybe 3 to 5 groups to play through, and so like if I see that, great, but that'll give me a good idea of where the game's at right now. And so when I say, hey, anyone that's following me, if you want to check this out, please let me know. You know, we'll do an open beta or whatever. Then that's a completely different ball game. Like at that point, it should be slightly more stable. And so, I don't know. That's all I got.
I think that's smart. It's not an easy question when, you know, how do you know if it's stable enough, and are you going to upset everybody's playtests and progress and stuff? I don't think you can say have 100% confidence on that point, but you can have some degree of confidence on it, I think, and you can turn out to be wrong, but to some degree that's the agreement, I guess. Burning that goodwill is non-trivial, but I don't think anyone should be, you know, feel betrayed as a playtester if they agree to playtest your beta and next week you decide that the characters aren't astronauts, they're firefighters. Like that's how it goes. Like you're playtesting a game. It doesn't mean they're all going to stay with you and be playtesters, and you might lose some of your playtester, you know, pool or something by doing that, especially doing it over and over again. But I think there's a grace area in there where you can expect not to be perfect and it'll be okay. And where that threshold is hard to say, but there is a threshold where you ask too much, but I think you have a pretty wide target area there to hit. That it's gonna be probably okay.
Cool. So to build to our final question, how do you know when it's done?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Well, I have an answer of sorts. It's probably the one you're expecting. It's never done. There's no such thing as done. You just abandon it. You decide to stop working on it. And I think you can have good reasons for abandoning it and bad reasons for abandoning it. But I think it will always be true that if you had chosen not to release it and finish it, and kept working on it, years later you could make a better version of it. I think that's probably true.
But sometimes that should just be a different game entirely, yeah. Yes,
and I think Ron Edwards has taken a stand on this point, and I appreciate his position. You know, people say, dude, Sorcerer is an amazing game, but the book is not an amazing book. And you could do it better. And he's always said over the years, like, it's just an artifact of its time. That's the game I made when I made it. I'm not going to revise it. I made other games. I made Troll Babe, one of the best RPGs ever made. What do you want from me? That was Sorcerer. I love that he kind of did the director's commentary version of Sorcerer, which is an incredible book. I would love to have that for so many other role-playing games. I mean, the Ars Magica version of that, for example, would be incredible. Yeah, I think that's a sane way to work. And this goes back to the Danger Patrol and Geiger counter ideas, right? Like, how do you know when it's done? How do you know when that beta you're never going to work on that beta again, and you're just going to make the next version of it, and that one is a dead end, so to speak, but it's a finished game that's online for people to play. But I'm never going to revise the beta version of Danger Patrol. That version is as done as it's going to get, and other people have made arguably better versions of that game out of those materials. But I'm not going to go back and finish the beta version. I'm going to make other Danger Patrol games as I'm going to put, or Agon for that matter. I have a revised version of Agon on my Google Docs that every now and then I look at as, I'm going to do this, and then I think, why would I do that? So I don't know. I guess that's my answer. Right? The way I know I'm done is I've done the alpha process. I've gone through the beta process to a point where the game is stable, and it may not, at that point, it may not be the game I really wanted to make. That's very likely that the stable, fun beta version of the game kind of resembles the game I intended to make, but is not actually the game I intended to make. I think that's the most likely outcome, probably. But when it gets to that point where I've decided to finish it, I've decided to do that because that beta playtesting cycle has answered all the outstanding questions. The mechanics are clear to the playtesters, and I still have within me a desire to finish the book and publish the book or the text or the video or whatever it is.
Can I ask you about the desire for a second? Because
yeah.
One of the things I hear a lot of people say is that by the time you finish your game, you should hate it. And one of the interesting things I've always disagreed with this. And part of it is if you don't enjoy it when you release it, you have a really difficult 6 months to a year ahead of you, right? Because what you have to do after that is promote your game and play it with people. And
yep.
and it's way worse to do that if you've already hate the game, right? And I can understand feeling burnout or wanting a break from it or something, right? But then I feel like you finish it, you wait a while, and then when you love it again, you release it, right? So that way when you're doing the marketing, which, I mean, it's not like fake marketing, when you just talk to people about your game and why you make it and why you love it, it comes across as a genuine thing, right? I think people respond to that. And it sure makes it easier to do, for sure.
Absolutely, and I think that phase of the process is part of the process. It's not that you do all that and then you release it, and you do all that and you finish, and then the release is this other thing. I think you have to treat that, especially now. The release part of the process is a huge part of your job if you're the indie guy, you're the designer and the publisher and the marketer and everything. Right, Stras just said Kickstarter on chat. It's very likely that campaign starts at that point, and that's a really key part of the process. And I think Vincent has shown us, not just in the text of Apocalypse World, how to convey these ideas as a game designer, but the release process of Apocalypse World is a really instructive model where he knew during playtesting that this game was very hackable and people were really excited to make their own stuff out of it. So the design of Apocalypse World was not just the book and the text of the game, but it was the design of the Apocalypse World forums, and the sort of loose hackable license, ask Vincent permission thing attached to it, the encouragement of other people's works to come out. That whole year and a half after Apocalypse World came out was intentionally designed to occur. The forums were set up, the discussions were prompted, the blog posts were primed to do that. It was all part of the process of making Apocalypse World, was to release it in a way that launched all of that stuff. So I don't think everyone has to do that as a required part of their game. But I do think to say if the day that Apocalypse World came out at Gen Con was the day of peak exhaustion and being tired of the project, you've got a year and a half of work to do after that, and that's a bad combo to like crash at that point when you're really, that's the launch pad for the project.
Yeah, it's cool that you mentioned community design, because Judd talked about that on the last time, where he was talking about how he creates communities for games that don't even have final versions yet, which I thought was awesome. It's definitely one of the things you have to do as design. Is you don't have to necessarily create communities, but you have to think about how people are going to be grouped around your game and find each other, and being a sort of quasi-official channel gives you a lot of clout as the creator to steer people in one direction or another, or to tolerate certain kinds of things and not tolerate other kinds of things, whether that's sexism or hacks or whatever it is, right? You kind of have to think about how the community around your game works, right? For sure.
So I think I agree with you with the don't hate your game thing. It kind of puzzles me, but I see where some of that comes from, and some of it comes from the fact is that at the point that you decide that you're going to make this game, you're very excited about it, but at the point that the 80% of the work is done, oftentimes you're changing hats, and a lot of times you're going to be doing jobs that you may not want to do or are not good at, and you're not really sure what you're doing, and that changes the process from being play, because design to a lot of designers is play, right? You're playing with your group and making this stuff and seeing the joy in people's eyes. That's really what you're after. And then they're telling you have to design a community. You have to you have to worry about layout. What about finances? Where's your spreadsheets for finances? That Kickstarter better be planned. And so all of a sudden it stops being fun and it starts being work. And when you already have a day job and then you get the second job, it really kind of can wear on people. So I can see why this exhaustion will kick in, and I can see, where do you find your sources of inspiration and energy? And Nathan Paoletta talks about champions, like the people that get the game and are super excited for it, and how to channel that and sort of like bring that in and sort of like use that not just to boost it, but sort of to like supplant it when you're exhausted from trying to promote something and whether it's working or not. But as to when it's done, that's a good question. Everybody always says it's never done. I think it's probably done, like, in your heart of hearts, it's probably done when your group can play it and you're happy and you think you have a good product. But I think it's done when the versions are not changing rapidly anymore, and most people that encounter it will be able to play it in a way that's close to sort of like what you tried to communicate with the text of the base. And I think that's probably the time when it's a good idea to start thinking about, where you're going from it. And also, if you only release in PDF, you can always update it. So, if you're just like, I totally want to add this thing, you can just, send it out to your backers or your friends or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's a strength that we shouldn't overlook. We have the luxury of that option if we want it. So might as well use it if that's what you want. If you want to have a case where you really don't have to be done and print 1,000 books and blah blah blah, you do not have to do that. You can continue to update and continue to have versions, and why not do it? There's no downside really.
Well, there's a whole thing about legitimacy and product, and some people just love the feel of paper and what you bring.
Yeah. We're old paper-loving dinosaurs. We'll all be dead soon.
Well, there's also something about your relationship with your audience, right? I mean, I think one of the things that the new honesty or the new honesty came out of was a lot of indie games were releasing second versions like a year or two after the first version came out, right? During that period of time, at least, and it was, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all necessarily. Totally, because it's not like the first version stops existing, right? Or that is, and in very few cases, I think the second version was head and tails above the first version, right? Like they're still the same game, right? It's not like the first version wasn't fun. You couldn't play it, 20 sessions, 30 sessions of the original version and not have a good time, right? It's sort of like like in some ways they're just totally different games, right? And in some cases, right? Or they're not totally different, but they're kind of related. And I mean, I think it's one of those things where I always think about games as like especially indie games, they're just not that expensive, right? I mean, it's $20 for a game, right? Like crazy,
If
right?
that,
It's like going to the movies twice, right? Or maybe even once pretty soon if you're in New York City. So like, it's not like it was. I mean, it's a time commitment for sure, and I think that's where people feel like, oh, I've wasted these people's time by giving them a game. Like whatever, man. If they played that game and they had fun, and it was multiple people's good time for a single experience, right? That's like the cost of a beer, right? Like it's really not a thing that you have to worry about, right? So I don't necessarily think that everybody should be thinking in advance about versioning after you've already released a quote final version of your game. But I also think you don't need to be scared of it, right? It's totally a thing that you can do if you feel inclined to. But like John says about Aegon, you could write that game, but you could also like write the next game that you're going to write, right? You don't need to feel guilt that like you didn't write the game that you wanted or something, and now you feel like you owe people that have to go back and do it. I think that's mostly a trap.
I think we can all relate to that in other mediums. Like if a filmmaker just kept me making a movie over and over again for their whole career,
like Star Wars Special Edition.
Yeah, I don't think we would enjoy that. I think you just move on, make something else. If a musician just rewrote the same song over and over again forever, I think all of creative endeavor is like that. You grow so much after you make a thing, after you finish a thing, that your next thing, hopefully, will be better. It's not always true, but that kind of growth is just part and parcel of making stuff and obsessing about it and worrying that I'm just going to keep working on it. It can be better. It can be better. I don't know. I think there's a perception sometimes from the outside that for Jonathan and I, like, that's maybe what we're doing. That's why that we have all these beta games that never get done because we're obsessed about making them perfect. And for my part, that's not true at all. It's literally just time. Like the time it takes to finish it is not something I have available to do, or interest or some other factor, some resource that I don't have available to me. It's not like I haven't been working on Danger Patrol since 1996 when we first started playing it. I haven't been working on it every day since then, trying to make it the perfect game ever. There's just a limit to your interest and a limit to what you have available. And hitting this arc, and maybe this is the way of answering the question, like the way something's done maybe is that you get into this mode where you're in the pocket, you're in the space where I have the momentum, I have the playtesters, this is going well, we're making progress, we're hitting my milestones, oh my god, the text is almost done, wait a minute, it's in layout, holy crap, we don't need to rewrite this anymore, oh shit, I guess we can print it, we're done. Like maybe that's part of the deal. Like planning is part of the process, but it's also like recognizing that you're in a place where you are able to finish the thing. That you've been given this opportunity through circumstance where you recognize, because I feel like I'm always making games. I'm constantly in a process of making games, and only every now, because I'm not doing it for a living quite yet, only every now and then do I look up from the game making process, which I'm always doing, and go, oh wait, this might be a product. This thing I'm always doing. Now maybe it's a product, and I need to treat it like making a product.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and feel very. I feel like that you described exactly what happens in my head, which is probably not surprising, but for sure. And I think in some ways the whole thing with Geiger Counter and Danger Patrol is the reason that those stand out as examples is that we haven't given up on them yet, right? That if we'd given up on them years, decades ago, that they would just look like all the other stuff that we've done that's like half finished and put aside, right? But because they have a following of people who keep playing them, right? There's always the question, when is it going to get done, right? And I agree with you. And the reason it's not getting done is because I'm not working on it, right? That's the reason. And I'm not working on it because I'm doing other stuff, right? And in some ways, and in the beginning, that definitely wasn't the case. I think for a long time, they were more white whale-like, and I was like, I remember there was one time I was unemployed for 6 months where I tried to finish Geiger Counter, and basically nothing happened in those 6 months. Like I wrote multiple versions of stuff, I did a bunch of layout for it, I blah blah blah, but it wasn't productive. It didn't actually lead the game anywhere closer to being done. So sometimes it's not just time. Sometimes it's like you just can't. You're not in a place to do it. Like whatever John says, for whatever reason, right? And I definitely empathize strongly with the feeling that sometimes you're in the mode to finish things, right? And when you're in that mode, you need the time, and sometimes you just don't have it, right? Sometimes I'm like, if I had the time this week, I would totally publish another Planar Codex supplement for Dungeon World, because I would just sit down and write it. We would play it a couple times. It would be awesome, and then we would release it, right? And I don't have weeks that are like that, right? But the interesting thing that happened with Restless was I wrote it in a weekend, and it's part of a month-long competition, which was kind of hilarious. But it's really close to being done now, except for the fact that I haven't played it. So once I played a bunch and feel confident in myself, other people have already played it and said it's pretty close to being done. Then I'll be like, well, checked all those boxes. It works for me. It works for other people. I fixed the things that were bothering me about it. Boom, right? It's ready. And that's just why did that happen? Why doesn't that happen every weekend where I can sit in front of a football game and being be super productive and the game's done, right? I wish it was. In some ways, I wish it was that way. But games aren't like that. Sometimes you get in a groove and you're pop that game out and that game is done. And then as I recall, John wrote Aegon in 2 weeks or something crazy like that before Gen Con 2006. He was supposed to be doing something else, working on Stranger Things, and had this moment of inspiration and just was putting all that other stuff aside. Here's this game, came straight out of my brain. Why does that happen sometimes and not happen other times? Hell if I know. It's a weird combination of inspiration and time and something that sticks in your brain that you can't get rid of, that you really can't do anything else until you finish it. And this Jedi Dogs and Vineyard supplement I'm working right now is this is obsessed in my brain right now. And if I had time and I could just be this week, I'm gonna just sit down and crank this thing out. We would be playing it next weekend, and it would be done.
It's so good. It's so good.
But I gotta write papers this week. So is everything that I posted the only things that'll ever exist about that game? Maybe, probably not. I really care about it and hope that I finish it, but it's all circumstantial. By the time that I have time to work on it, maybe I'll care about other things, So it's I don't know. I don't know why some games get finished for me and some don't. It's it's crazy convolution of factors.
Gotta learn to bottle the lightning.
I don't know. I've never been able to bottle it.
This process happened for me for sure. When I first got into the business doing graphic design, I did it as a hobby the same way I do game design. I have done game design as a hobby for years, and I had a very similar experience making that transition from finishing things when I felt I was in the place to finish them, doing things when I was inspired. All those luxuries that vanish when you show up for a job and do 8 hours of work and have to turn in a product for a client. And that transition can be really hard to do. And it has huge benefits for learning how to bottle that lightning, and not just that, but also how to get to it much faster. And I feel like as a graphic designer, I've learned a way to access that part of my creativity in a really rapid way and do things that I used to sit around and wait to be inspired to do. Instead, I do them in 20 minutes and just just do it. And I'm starting. I feel like I'm maybe transitioning into that in the same way with game design, but it's not quite the same thing because game design is so much bigger. It for me anyway, it includes the graphic design discipline plus a bunch of other stuff. But there is that learning how to do it in a more rapid way, and then transitioning to a place where if you don't have this luxury we've been talking about, this kind of sprawling hobbyist designer thing, where you really do say, I'm going to release a game in the next 6 months, I feel like what happened to me as a graphic designer has to happen. There's no way around it. You're not guaranteed, once you set out to do that, to do your best work. You're guaranteed to finish the project, and you have to make realize the tension between those two things. You can't decide I'm going to publish my game in March and it's going to be the best game I've ever made. Those are not compatible ideas. You have to prioritize one over the other. It's the classic, right? It's the iron triangle, right? It's good, cheap, or fast, and you pick two. There's no way around that. And I think having unrealistic goals in that way, they all feed into this idea of when something's finished. How do I publish? When am I done? I want to release in January, and I have all these problems. It all feeds into that. It's either this catch as catch can, inspiration-driven hobby, or it's a deadline-fueled project. And those two worlds are not, they're different. They're just different worlds.
If you do get any tips, you should write them down and make sure to put a post up for anybody that might follow.
Should I say that again? I didn't hear you.
I said if you do get any tips about activating real fast and trying to get things done and getting ready to go in the 20 minutes or whatever, you should write it down and make a post so that anybody that follows might have at least an inkling of what to do somewhere somehow.
Well, the sad truth of that is do it 10,000 times. That's the real answer. I don't know a shorter way to do it.
Speaking of doing it 10,000 times, something if you want to know when a game is done, perhaps you just need to finish games, right? And so one thing that I actually mentioned is try to find things that give you permission to just get something out there. And the example that I used was Jonathan actually has a little 2-page thing, and Atlas Reckoning is big, and it's going to take a little while for me to polish all the edges and make sure that it's in a shape that I'm comfortable, putting it in front of people. But so this is a funny fact. I don't actually have a published game, not in an official capacity where you can go somewhere and click on it and put monies in and get game out or whatever. But this will be the first one that's gonna do that, and it happened in a week because of how it was rigged. It was just this small thing. It's like write 2 pages. It's not meant to limit you. It's meant to just show you exactly how low the bar is. Do this stuff, and I sat down with a fellow game designer, and we hacked something out in like an evening. And it went through a couple of small revisions. It went through a couple of playtests, and now it's gonna be put in front of people. And it's only I think it's 3 pages or something. So I think it's important that if you want to have a white whale project and you want to have this giant thing and you are wondering when it's done, just keep making little things that are okay to put out there, and eventually you'll kind of get a bead, and maybe that'll help.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say too is that like John said, do this 10,000 times, right? And I don't know, what am I on now? 7,000. So I feel like I'm getting there, right? One of the things is to think about. One of the things that's been helpful for me, I feel like, as maturing as a game designer, has been thinking about all the things I've done as partially preparation for what I'm doing now and what I'm gonna do. That as not as wasted time or spinning my wheels or whatever. Because I've made or started working on hundreds and hundreds of games at this point, right? So yeah, I hope I am getting better at finishing stuff. At least that's the hope, I think. And the other thing I wanted to say was the thing that John said about how he's able to do it in graphic design, but not in game design quite yet, really spoke to me a lot, because in grad school, one of the things that's really obvious to me is that having worked in a think tank, doing editing and working in our like publishing department for a long time, is like I'm totally not intimidated by reading scholarly texts and writing scholarly texts. Like I do that. Like I could write my dissertation now. Like I don't, like I could just do it. It would take me a while, but I'm not intimidated by that process at all. I don't need to sit around and dream about what am I going to do or whatever, right? Like I can just like punch that out, right? I can just turn that switch on. We're doing this thing. It doesn't have to be the only thing I'm ever going to write ever. I don't have any dreams about it being this white whale thing. I'm just like, I just do that. And I know how to edit things, and I know how to think about, I know how to incorporate text into what I'm writing, all that stuff. So the academic stuff I'm totally not at all worried about. But that's not true of a lot of people in my cohort of students, right? There's a lot of people who haven't done that thousands of times, and so it's interesting for me now to think about what would it be like for game design to be like that for me, where I just do it. I turn that switch on and crank that out. And it's interesting because I kind of feel like in some ways Restless was a little bit like that. That's partially why I was able to do it. It was this culmination of all these design things that I'd done, and I knew exactly what I was going to do before I started it, and then I just did it. So that's kind of inspirational, at least, to think that that isn't some alien thing that I can imagine someday happening, right? It's something that I've touched a little bit, and is a place that you could get to.
Games don't really die. You just put them away and then reuse the ideas later because you've already made a thing. It just nobody knows that you've made a thing except your brain.
Yeah, that's true. It all feeds into your skill set. Every hour, every minute you spend on it isn't wasted. Well, that's not true. It's possible to waste that time, but for the most part, I don't think that happens. I think you're always training yourself to do something. I forget what instructor of mine told me that a long time ago. I like that idea that you're training yourself to slack off and not do your work, or you're training yourself to be reliable and committed to something. Everything you're doing is a training process, and I think that's what we're talking about to some degree. And when it comes to creative work, since we are not the author of our own thoughts, it can sometimes be terrifying to think like, I can't make myself have an idea. That just happens. I don't know why it happens. It just does. What if it doesn't happen? And when I first started doing creative work for pay on a deadline, that was a real weird thought to have. Like, this person's paying me to think of something and make it, and I don't know what it is right now, but I have to give it to them next week. And I think all creative work, whether it's writing or coding or graphic design or whatever it is, you learn to trust yourself. You learn to trust the unconscious part of you that you don't have direct access to, who is your real self. They do know what they're doing, or they don't, and you learn that, and you realize you have to try harder. But that repetition, that process of repetition, that process of facing that adversity, having some degree of success, even if it's a tiny degree of success amidst otherwise catastrophic failure, it's like an evolutionary process. The successes transmit their genes to the next phase, and that next phase is more successful than the previous. And I wish there was a shortcut. I wish I could give you some like kernel of wisdom that would allow you to skip the next 10 years of effort to anyone watching, but I think that's just how it is. Like, you just have to do the work. You have to put in the time and develop the skills.
And the good news is to everybody is you've already started, right? I mean, if you're watching this video cast, you've already done it. One of the things I would say about
sorry, Jonathan, I want to say one thing real quick. The quality of the product is not dependent on that. It's what we're talking about is accessibility of the skill. how easy it is to access, the very first thing you do might be the greatest thing ever made. And we've seen that from some friends of ours. I mean, Avery and Jackson, for example, like their first works are masterpieces of role-playing design. It's not that all this time and effort is necessary to do good work. I feel like all this time and effort makes the skill easier to access and makes the process less painful potentially. But it has no bearing on quality whatsoever. More time does not mean better work at all. It just means possibly an easier process.
Or a more consistent one, right? Like sometimes you get the inspiration and it's all wonderful and you do it, but you can't necessarily count on that happening every time, right? One of the things I wanted to say about your 10,000 times example, and I think that's a really, really good one, is what it does is it increases your baseline ability, right? That when you're the quality of work that you can turn out when you're not inspired reaches this point that it's good enough, right? Which is kind of what you're talking about in design terms, right? If this guy wants you to design a thing in a week, you could be inspired and it could be mind-blowing, or you could not be inspired and it's really great, right? That's the level you want to get to, right? And because for the customers, I mean, they can't pay you for mind-blowing because that's not going to happen every time, right? They're paying you to do a really, really good job, right? And I think if you can get to that point with game design, where you're increasing the baseline level, and part of what it is it's filling your head with all these half-finished games, right? So when you reach for what the game is that you're making, all you're doing is plugging in these various half-finished things that you've already done, and then putting some nice coating on the outside of it, right? You've done all the design already, and that's partially why it's easy to access that stuff, right? And then sometimes you have an inspiration and you throw that into the mix, and then who knows what happens at that point. But it's to the point. So I think that's the process. That's what happens when you get to that point, right?
Yes, sorry. I thought Strauss was going to talk. I was waiting. I agree with that.
You guys are rocking it. I'm good.
Well,
we're at the 3-hour mark.
as usual, I would just keep doing this forever. But I think as each one gotten longer than the last, I think maybe it has. That's fine. That's fine with me. Most people look at
a high note though of successful mastery of game design.
Yeah, I need to look and see if I can actually chop these up. That might be smart to do them in hour chunks or something, because it's a lot to digest all at once. But I thank you so much again for taking the time and having this conversation, hanging out with me. It's been awesome.
Thanks, Josh. Your comments were super awesome and actually very thought-provoking on my part as well. I know sometimes I think sometimes more junior members of the game design community don't hear that as much, but the things that you think are really awesome and are inspiring to me as well. So please keep doing what you're doing.
Yes, thank you, Strauss. Your work is very inspiring to me as well.
There's not so much of it out there yet. I'll keep at.
Keep at it. Keep playtesting my game.
Ready for the next version, so bring it on.
Well, I'm putting it out for Rachel tomorrow, theoretically, so you'll probably see it. Okay, well, we should say goodbye. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Appreciate your questions and everything. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.